Patrick. February 13, 3:45 p.m. Drumming his fingers against the steering wheel, Patrick Edward Dunn stared out the windshield. Tap, tap, tap. Barely aware of the movement, his focus was on the ranch-style house in front of him. Less than a minute before, his two children had clambered from his ancient truck and trudged up to the house. Neither had bothered to wave goodbye or even mutter a word. He'd just given them the news he wouldn't be taking them to his cabin in the woods this weekend. Not that they'd shown any signs of disappointment. Since they'd reached their teens, moody silence was their stock response to everything. Tap, 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 tap. He leaned forward and squinted up at the darkening sky. Rain and snow were headed their way. If his leg acting up was any indicator, it might be smart if he stayed in town. Anyhow, he didn't want to deal with his children's mother, Kimberly, throwing a fit because he couldn't get them back in time for school on Monday. It wouldn't be the first time he'd been holed up in the mountains with the kids as the snow had kept them from town. Still, he'd been looking forward to spending time with the kids in his hideaway. He'd planned to take them fishing, teach them a thing or two about the great outdoors. Thanks to Kimberly's determination to keep him from them, he didn't see them nearly enough. She was always looking for ways to sabotage those father-kid moments. That morning, she'd sent him the weather report, making it clear that, should he take them up to the cabin, she'd be revisiting her lawyer. Again. That never ended well for him. He wasn't willing to risk it, even if it meant losing this chance to spend quality time with his son and daughter. Tap, 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 tap. With a heavy sigh, Patrick turned the car over. The ancient Chevy pickup that had been his dad's back on the farm let out a throaty revving noise before lurching to life. It was a familiar sound, one that brought a smile to his lips. He ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair before glancing once more at the house. A small part of him had expected his children to at least wave or come back to kiss his cheek like they did when they were little. But the door was shut, and the curtains tightly closed. They'd be glued to their iPhones watching TikTok by now, or whatever social media site was the latest craze. He reversed out of his ex's driveway, just as the first fat snowflakes hit his windshield. At least Kimberly had been right this time, though that did little to ease the frustration. His shoulders tightened as he navigated through her West Salem neighborhood. Once, he'd called this his home too. For a good 10 years, they'd been the perfect family. But his late hours on patrol with the Salem police and her growing frustrations at not having another kid finally tore them apart. Familiar streets slipped past him as he neared the exit of the sprawling housing development. For a second, he considered turning back and telling the kids he'd take them up to the cabin after all. But he didn't. Besides, he still needed to finish packing up his things at his own place. Then, it would be done. His lawyer had called him earlier to tell him the papers were through and he was divorced. For the third time. The thought brought on an inward groan as he slowed at the stoplight. Tap, 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 tap. This light always took an eternity to turn. He reached for the radio, turning the dial once, twice, 3 times before finally landing on his favorite talk radio. Except all he got was fuzz. It felt like he just couldn't catch a break. Not that it was anything new to him. He switched off the radio with a grunt. His fingers immediately itched to tap, but he fought the urge as he stared at the stoplight. Finally, the light turned green and he opened up the throttle. His truck belched out a cloud of black smoke, letting him know he needed to stop at the auto parts store. He was overdue for an oil change. Ever since his world collapsed that afternoon 2 years ago, so many things had piled up. The reminder of his injury had him moving his left hand to his leg, massaging the puckered scar through his jeans. Leaving West Salem behind, he merged onto Highway 22. Sleet hit his windshield as he crossed the bridge. Without the distraction of the radio, his mind wandered to the 1,000,001 things he needed to do in town. Then, tomorrow, he'd head to the cabin alone. Now that he wouldn't have the kids, 7 whole days of solitude stretched ahead of him. A wave of guilt shot through him. Though, at least it would give him time to fix the deck stairs that had sagged and paint the front room. Screeching tires pulled him from his thoughts. He looked about, watching as the large Escalade next to him smashed into the car in front, which had come to a standstill. Slamming on the brakes, he just barely navigated his truck to the side of the road. Ice must have already started forming because several other cars collided, pushing one another down the hill and into the intersection at the bottom. Turning the truck off, he grabbed his keys and jumped out into the chilly afternoon. People were piling out of their vehicles. Everyone had the same dazed looks on their faces, their eyes darting about. His fingers tapped his hip where his gun should have been, before moving to his shoulder to feel for his missing badge. Old habits he couldn't break. He ran toward a crushed Subaru that had smashed into the back of a bright yellow camper van. He peered into the windows at the 50-something woman behind the wheel. She had a gash on her forehead that spewed blood down her face, staining her once white cashmere scarf a bright pink, though otherwise she seemed unhurt. Still, he knocked on her window. She fumbled for a moment before cracking the door. "Are you okay, ma'am?" She blinked up at him, clearly disoriented. Her eyes didn't focus despite staring straight at him. He worried she was suffering from a concussion. He reached for his phone, dialing 911 without glancing, before holding it to his ear. Silence greeted him, which brought on a frown. His free hand tapped against his leg. He let out a gruff sigh at the sight of the 0 bars in the upper corner of the phone screen. Turning toward the hills of West Salem, he took in the gunmetal gray clouds that were rolling in. The towers must have been knocked out. Thanks to the weather, every instinct from decades on the police force was itching to kick in. Tap, 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 tap. But he wasn't a police officer anymore. He was a mere civilian. The thought was unwelcome as he turned back to the woman, her eyes still glassy as she stared back at him. Her gaze slipped past him. Pure terror widened her eyes as her mouth dropped open. Instinctively, he swung round, right hand automatically moving to his empty hip. A curse escaped him as screams filled the air. Careening toward the bridge and the steep incline into Salem's streets below was a shiny log truck. Pat would have bet his last dollar this was the driver's first load of large trees. The truck was too shiny and out of place as it barreled down the highway. Ice already forming on the bridge helped its journey along as it steamrolled stalled cars out of its way. He needed to get the woman out of the car before the truck reached them. She was now struggling with her seatbelt. The damn thing was stuck in its buckle. Pat jumped into action, diving into the car to free her, praying something slowed the log truck down.
Holly, February 13th, 7 p.m. Opening her eyes, Holly Winters found herself submerged in darkness. Disoriented, all she could do was stare into the inky blackness that floated above her. She was used to the bright lights of the hallway flooding her room, and the nightlight the nurses refused to remove from her tiny room. Finally, though, her wish for darkness had been granted. Yet, she couldn't allow herself to enjoy it, not when her head was pounding and her throat raw. She stretched out her hand to the bedside table, bringing the cup to her lips. Empty. A moan escaped her as she felt the dryness in her mouth. Pressing her right hand to her forehead, she turned her head sideways toward the door, squinting. Nothing alerted her to any activity out in the hall. Something wasn't right. She tried to clear the fog that lingered in her head. Disconnected thoughts bobbed about uselessly as she pushed herself into a sitting position. Surely a nurse should be outside. It was as if the world had stopped. What is going on? Her head continued to spin as she stared at the murky wall across from her bed. Gingerly, she brought a hand back to her head, letting her fingers linger over the dressing. She couldn't remember why her head was bandaged, though it might explain the pain and confusion. Neither were strangers to her, not after spending almost 3 decades here. Moving her hand away from the bandages, she waited for her eyes to adjust. It would only be a matter of minutes before the emergency generator powered up, and a nurse would stop by to assure her that everything was fine. But none of that happened. Her eyes kept flitting toward the door. They locked it most of the time. Her doctors had reassured her this was to keep her safe, but she'd figured long ago it was to keep her prisoner. The urge to move to the door was overwhelming. She needed to know what was happening, but the blackness was pressing in on her. Unable to grasp at her thoughts, she felt her heart racing and her breathing ragged. The last thing she needed was another panic attack, further proof that she would never get better, that she could never go home. She blinked as tears pricked her eyes. Still, her gaze didn't shift from the door. She was used to the constant winking red light on the lock, taunting her. "You're locked in, you crazy woman. Don't even think about getting past me." Yet it wasn't flashing now. Wincing in pain, she pressed her hand to her head again. This time it came away sticky with blood. She wiped her hands on the stiff sheets of her bed. Overly starched. She'd gotten used to them by now, though they always felt like cardboard. A tear tracked down her cheek, and she let her eyes close. Years ago, when she'd still been adjusting to life at the hospital, she'd had an intern leading one of her therapy classes. The young woman's eyes had shone in a way that had made Holly feel safe, a rarity in a place that routinely ripped away the souls from their inmates. The young doctor had taught her how to close her eyes and start listing things to stall the rising panic. 4 things I can feel, she whispered into the blackness. Sheets. Bandages. Skin. Hair. Her fingertips reached around, feeling the coolness of the sheets, the roughness of the dressing, smooth skin, and her dry hair. Already, she could feel herself letting the anxiety go. It didn't always work, but with her mind still foggy, the distraction was enough to calm her shallow breathing. 3 things I can hear. Pausing, she relaxed her ears. The world was oddly quiet. She peeled her eyes open and looked back over at the door. Something must have happened. A couple weeks ago, there'd been a lockdown. Perhaps another patient had gotten their hands on the scissors from the craft room. Slowly, she pulled aside the several layers of bedding and slipped out of her bed. Her feet were bare, though she didn't notice the cold from the vinyl floor as she padded to the door. She hesitated before she placed her hand on the handle. She knew it would be locked, but that didn't stop her from pressing down. The door creaked open. A sharp intake of breath. She stared at the crack for a moment before peering out into the hallway. Her whole body shivered, though she didn't know if this was excitement or the cold. She couldn't make out anything in the darkness, not even the other doors across the hall. In the back of her head, a voice screamed at her to get back to bed. She didn't want to get into trouble. She knew what happened if you broke the rules. Being out of her bed was bad enough, but leaving her room at night unescorted was the biggest rule she could be breaking. Yet, her feet still carried her into the hall.
Patrick.
Help me. Please, I can't get out.
The woman's eyes were frantic as she stared up at Pat.
There's something wrong with the seatbelt.
Unable to stop himself, Pat glanced over his shoulder at the log truck as it continued its relentless progress toward her car, its harsh horn blasting the bitter afternoon. Several people were diving from their vehicles as they realized they were in its path. Reaching for his back pocket, his fingers found the familiar weight of his pocket knife. The same one his father had gifted him the day he left for boot camp. "I'll get you out." The woman choked on a sob as she looked straight through him. He didn't need to read her face to know that they had little time. All he could do was hope it was enough as he went to work to cut away at her seatbelt. The woman wriggled about as she forced her fingers onto the retractor, her other hand on the buckle, desperate to free herself, trying but failing to keep her composure. "This isn't working," she said. "It will." But the more he sawed at the stubborn seatbelt that refused to budge, the more he worried she was right, that he wouldn't be able to save her, and she would perish in the cold, murky waters of the River Willamette, for surely the truck would crash her car off the bridge. His fingers longed to tap, but he couldn't. Every damn second counted here, and he needed to focus.
Please, just go, or we'll all be killed.
He glanced up, meeting the woman's widening eyes. Tears were spilling over her cheeks as she struggled to accept her fate. He heard screams as another man hurried toward the car, urging him to move away. "She's stuck," Pat threw over his shoulder at the insistent bystander. "You aren't," the man shot back. "No point going over with her." This struck him as cold. For all this stranger knew, this was his wife, or a friend, a family member he'd been following into Salem. And there he stood, useless other than to throw out unhelpful words. "You go. No need for both of us to risk it," Pat warned the man. "Your funeral, man." Pat grumbled under his breath about the uselessness of people interfering and just getting in the way. His knife sawed in rough, jagged motions, digging into the tightly woven fabric. "Hang on in there," he soothed the woman. He cut away at the belt, his motions more forceful with each strike. Suddenly, he got a tear, and he doubled down with a few more frantic strikes. The woman winced as he nicked her through her shirt. Even as the blood blossomed across the fabric, he didn't slow his pace. "Get ready. Nearly done." With one last heave, the belt snapped free. The woman's eyes momentarily flashed with excitement as she realized she was free. But there wasn't time to celebrate this small win, not with the truck barreling toward them. He reached for her, wrapping his arms around her middle. His steps weren't as sure as he would have liked, his leg reminding him he still hadn't completed his required physical therapy sessions as he heaved the woman from the car. Thankfully, she didn't struggle against him as they cleared the vehicle, scrambling backward through the pelting snow as the truck careened into her vehicle. The sound of metal biting into metal filled the air as the log truck bulldozed her compact sedan to the edge of the bridge. Pat's arms cradled the woman while they watched together as her car, now crushed like an empty soda can, teetered for several seconds before finally tipping over the edge. A moment passed before the splash of the car entering the water reached their ears, followed by the bigger splash of the log truck joining the sedan. On shaky legs, Pat finally let go of the woman and stood. He offered her a hand that she accepted, barely glancing at him, her eyes fixed on the spot where her car had been just moments before. If they'd wasted any more time, Pat was certain it would have been a different outcome, one that saw him watching as she drowned in the icy waters of the Willamette. "You saved me," the woman said slowly, turning to look at him. He shook his head, avoiding eye contact. A gut response from too many other similar incidents. Years on the force had brought him close to death before, just as he had been then. He still couldn't bring himself to look at her, knowing that he would find bright eyes full of wonder and appreciation looking at him as though he were some hero. When he wasn't. He was an officer, or he had been. Now he wasn't even that. He was just an ordinary man doing the least he could to help his fellow people. Tap, 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 tap.
I can't thank you enough, the woman continued.
Again, he shook his head, this time taking a step back. A small crowd was gathering as people stared at the disfigured metal of the guardrail, the only reminder that a life had almost been lost. Pat's gaze drifted over the faces gathered there. Some bruised, others with various cuts, blood smearing down their cheeks. Most looked just as bewildered as he'd felt moments ago. "What happened?" someone shouted from several cars back. He wasn't sure if they meant now or earlier. Not that he had an answer for either situation. Something isn't right, he thought as he reached for his phone. Still without a signal. He glared at the screen. His gaze returned to the hills of West Salem. There should be the blinking red lights of the towers there, reassuring everyone that the modern age was indestructible. Yet, the landscape was dark. "Help!" came a man's voice. "I need help!" Dragging his eyes away from the hills, Pat was already moving as he searched for the person behind the voice. It took him less than a moment to come to another crushed car. This one was a small blue hatchback. The back seat rammed into the front, reducing the vehicle to half its size. A young girl sat clutching her arm, her back against the wrecked car. She was shivering uncontrollably. Her red-rimmed eyes stared out into the distance, tears streaming down her face. Next to her, crouching to examine her arm, was a man at least 10 years younger than Pat. "Can somebody help?" the man cried, without taking his attention away from the young girl. Pat approached, laying a hand on the man's shoulders. The man tensed as he glanced up, before immediately relaxing. "It's my daughter. She's injured, but my damn phone chose this moment to crap out on me," the man explained, his words nearly tripping over themselves. "The idiot that slammed into us is already gone. Unbelievable. It's like the world's ended." Pat crouched down, his hand still on the man's shoulder as he arranged his face to be neutral before looking at the girl. Her arm was broken. She needed medical attention, but no one could get a signal to make an emergency call. It seemed the cell towers had been knocked out. There wouldn't be an ambulance coming to whisk her away. Hell, not with the mess of smashed cars that lay strewn across the bridge. The poor girl was in for a long and painful wait. "I can make a splint until we can get her to the hospital," Pat said. "Thankfully, it's only a few blocks from here. Shouldn't be more than a few quick minutes' walk to ER." The man turned to Pat, blinking before frowning. "You aren't suggesting that I walk my daughter there?" "I am. In fact, I think that might be your only option." "No way in hell." Pat shrugged his shoulders as he threw his hands up. It seemed the man failed to understand the seriousness of the situation, that it would take some time for any emergency vehicles to make it to them, despite how close they were to the hospital. They'd have to take the westbound bridge first, battling the roadblocks he was certain would be there, before eventually turning around to make it here. There'd be other injuries along the way, many with more serious injuries than a fracture. Tap, 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 tap. This isn't looking good, Pat realized. The man continued to glare at him, his face getting redder by the second. Though perhaps that was just Pat's imagination taking over. "Let's get her arm in a splint first." The man got to his feet, giving Pat no other option but to stand as well. Pat towered over the man. Still in shape from the rigorous training he put himself through while on the force, even after his accident, he'd insisted on keeping to his arduous schedule, despite the many days his body refused to listen. Still, the man didn't seem to care that Pat had several inches and a few more pounds of muscle. His face was bright red, enraged on behalf of his daughter. As though that would help her. Pat had seen this a dozen times before. Parents or friends that felt useless as their loved one was in pain after an accident or attack. They lashed out at the first responders when they'd failed to meet some unrealistic expectations of care. Now, it was Pat's turn to be on the receiving end. He was just trying to be a good citizen. Not that he expected the guy to understand. Still, he forced himself to raise his hands. "Hey, I'm not looking for a fight. I can help." "I don't need your help," the man hissed.
Hell, I bet you're some perv. You came awfully quick. You'd be out of your mind if you think I'm about to let you lay so much as a finger on my daughter.
Hey, buddy, he's only trying to help. No need for that. Pat recognized the voice calling from behind him. It was the man from before, the one who tried to get Pat to step away from the woman and leave her to die. He just pulled that lady from her car, the stranger continued. They both would have died if he hadn't, so lay off. You're the one who was calling for help, remember? The father's face turned an even deeper shade of red. He pushed his daughter behind him, shielding her body with his own. The girl stumbled, and her arm jostled as her shoulder blades hit the side of the crushed car. Her father didn't even seem to notice when she cried out in pain. He was far too focused on the two men in front of him, and the growing crowd coming to investigate the newest disturbance on the bridge. Pat grimaced. There were always onlookers in a disaster.
You mind your own business. She's my daughter. I know what's best for her, not a couple of complete strangers.
Pat took a step back, as the father took one forward. The stranger from before took a few steps forward too, closing the gap with the stranger. There are more important things to worry about here than a guy who wants to put a splint on your daughter's arm.
She could have died today. Hell, you both could have died today. Back off, pal. The father's voice was a low growl. You know nothing about me and my daughter.
Pat could feel the tension growing. Both men looked about ready to take a swing, and with the adrenaline coursing through all of them, there was no telling how hard it would be to stop them once they got started. If he couldn't get the situation under control soon, things could boil over. And the last thing they needed right now was more injuries. Hey, I'm sorry. I just wanted to help, like he said, Pat began slowly. Let's all just calm down, okay? There's no need to get worked up. The father looked at Pat, then at the other man, his eyes darting between the two. I'm a father too. Pulling the former cop card wouldn't work here, but relating to him might. I have 2 kids, a son and a daughter. I was just telling you what I would do in your situation, but you're right. I know nothing about you and your daughter. I'm sorry. The father continued to watch him as the suspicion in his eyes gradually lessened. The 3 men went silent. Only then could they hear the low sobs of the young girl clasping her arm to her chest. As Pat watched, the anger on the man's face was replaced with concern. And something else. Shame, Pat thought. The father nodded. Yeah, okay. Just don't come near my daughter again. I'll take care of this. The stranger seemed to relax as well and stepped away. The father turned his back on the gathered group, murmuring to his daughter in soothing tones. Pat looked away from them, staring up at the Salem hills once more. Still, there were no lights, not atop the radio towers, not from houses, not even from the streetlights that should kick on right about now. That left the one needling question. What the hell happened?
Holly. Holly stood in the hall, stock still in the darkness. The overly bright fluorescent lights were missing, and her hands fumbled for the wall. Apart from the sound of her own shallow breaths, the place was eerily quiet. Usually, the sounds outside would drown out the noises in her head, and it felt strange to be in a vacuum of dark and silence. Though she knew this floor like the back of her hand, Holly felt unsure of herself. She'd spent the last 10 years on this ward. Here, they'd given her certain privileges, such as allowing her limited freedom to come and go, and dietary choices. Unlike many others, imprisoned in their stark rooms for years, left to rot. A decade ago, this had been her. But then Dr. Burke, the new medical director, came along, and they'd moved her here as a reward for her good behavior. It would take her 53 steps to reach the large desk where an orderly was stationed. Often a nurse or doctor would be nearby in case of an emergency or unruly patients. Too many nights, Holly had overheard the desperate cries of those being all but dragged back to their rooms. She shuddered. Early in her time at the hospital, she had been one of them. She used to wake, confused where she was, and call out for her mom. A cry that would go unanswered. Her mom was miles away, back in the town where she'd been born, continuing with a life they'd plucked her from. In the murky black of the night, all she'd ever wanted was the comfort of the woman who had raised her. She would stumble from her bed, confusion fogging her mind, and stagger into the halls. Most nights, she allowed them to coax her back to bed. Other nights, though, the fog was too dense, and she fought against anyone who even touched her. Footsteps startled her back to the present. She froze. A globule of caustic bile caught the back of her throat as her heart thudded against her ribcage. Calm down. A deep intake of breath, followed by a slow exhale. She should duck back into the safety of her room, but her throat was parched, and her head still pounding. She craved water, a large glass of it. Though with the pitch black closing in on her, she would be content to drink straight from the sink. 75 steps. That's how far she had to walk to make it to the floor's shared bathroom. It was within view of the orderly's desk. This used to upset her. She hated that she was always under scrutiny. Should she take too long in the bathroom, she'd end up talking to some doctor. Though, after so many years in the hospital, she should be used to it by now. At least enough to not overthink her bathroom habits. The footsteps were growing closer. From the lightness of them, they belonged to Rita, one of the RNs who'd been at the hospital forever. Not the most patient with visits to the bathroom under the best of circumstances. The last thing she wanted was a scolding from this nurse. Caught out in the hallway, having another panic attack. She'd have to face the stern disapproval on everyone's faces. Yet another mark against her. More days, more months, more years in the hospital. They would never let her out. Though she still clung to a thin hope. She wanted her mom, and to go back home. And she wanted to meet her son. Closing her eyes, she tried to picture his face. Her mother had sent her pictures from his time in the military. He had served bravely overseas. Unlike either of his parents, he was something to be proud of. Holly was prouder of him than she'd ever been of anything in her life. Being wrenched from him had been the most painful thing she'd ever experienced. Some days, she could forget how he came to be. She could ignore the pain and violence that had borne such a sweet bundle. But then came the thoughts. Memories of brutal, bony hands gripping her arms, overpowering tobacco breath in her face, and the salty tang of her tears would all return. When it was done, she'd lain on the floor, feeling hatred and shame, hurting all over. After that came the aftermath, the looks and whispers. No one had believed her when she'd come forward. A whimper of anguish escaped her just as the swish, swish, swish of gliding feet returned. She needed to move. Sucking in a deep breath, she counted backward from 5. Her chest still felt constricted, and her heart raced, but she opened her eyes, forcing one step in front of the other until she stood in front of the door to the restroom. A grimace formed on her lips as she pushed inside, just as the footsteps rounded the corner. With trembling hands, she eased the door shut behind her and flattened her back against the door, waiting for the inevitable knocking. But it never came. Instead, she listened as the steps faded away. She glimpsed a tiny window to the back of the room. The iron bars gave her the no uncertain message that she was a prisoner here. The dim light that filtered through was just enough for her to navigate the space. She tiptoed to the sinks and twisted a faucet, bending her neck to sip directly from the flow of water. When she straightened, she glimpsed herself in the mirror. Water dripped from her gaunt face. Her raven hair, shot through with streaks of white, lay limp against the bandage wrapped around her head. She looked every bit the unstable patient. She wiped away the droplets. Nothing she could do about the maroon circles under her eyes or the way her cheekbones protruded. Enough nutritionists had coaxed her to gain weight and reach a healthier size, but she'd ignored them. Skin and bones weren't attractive to men. Even the monster that had stolen everything from her. She willed away the thoughts swirling in her brain, clamping her eyes shut. Already that night, she'd allowed him to take up too much space in her head. Like they'd taught her in group therapy years ago, she focused on the one bright spot that had come from all the pain. Her son, Isaac. The months after his birth were a blur. Anger and rage had blinded her in those days. It wasn't until years later, after therapy and treatment, that she realized she'd missed out on the bonding. Hell, she'd missed out on his life. She had let the man who destroyed her life steal one more thing from her. Prying her eyes open, she stared at her reflection once more. Though she tried not to torture herself with futile dreams, thoughts of escaping the hospital and of leaving behind the life she knew entered her head. Most patients in her position faced spending the rest of their days here. It was only the fortunate few who proved they were rehabilitated that could once more join society. This would never be the case for her. Resigned to a miserable rest of her life in the hospital and never getting to see the amazing man she heard her son had grown into. Her mom had sent her pictures and told her everything about him. Yet, as she stood in the dark bathroom with a fuzzy head, bitter regret surged into the pit of her stomach. Suddenly, the walls were caving in on her. She needed to get back to her room, her safe place. Like a cocoon, she would wrap herself in its isolation. The irony wasn't lost on her. The place where she felt safe was at the same time her prison. Come on, girl, let's go. Turning away from the mirror, she peered out the doorway, waiting to see if the footsteps would return. All was quiet, and she stepped back out into the dark hallway. Treading softly along the corridor, she froze as she picked up agitated voices from the nurses' station. What the hell's going on? Everything's gone off. Lights, equipment, cell phones. Nothing's working. It's so strange. I should be long gone, but I couldn't get my car to start. Damn thing. Tried to call home to ask Carlos to come pick me up, but my cell's dead. Useless thing. The same thing happened with Jensen. He stomped off. And it's snowing a blizzard, too. After a pause, another voice sounded. I don't know, Rosa. It's some sort of massive power cut, but I don't understand why the generator hasn't kicked in. Where's the caretaker when you need him? Probably sleeping off that bottle of vodka he hides in the basement, as if we don't all know about that. I guess. Not that it matters. I am not sticking around. My shift finished half an hour ago. I need to go, even if I have to cut my way through gigantic snowdrifts. A sigh before. Of course, I understand, but can't you stay a while? Old Teddy Shanks has gone off again. You know what he's like. First chance he gets, it's to run for the mountains. He'll catch his death. Wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of Dr. Burke if he goes missing. Sorry, I would if I could, but I've got to get home to my kids. Teddy will be in the kitchen. He's always hungry. I'm sure he'll be helping himself to the Oreos I got last night by now. Nothing's safe when he's left alone. Anyways, he hurt his ankle the other day, and he isn't moving so great. What a nightmare this place is. Honestly, not surprised at any of this. Wish they'd spend some money on it instead of pocketing the state's money for themselves. The building's in a terrible state. I'm surprised it's not falling to bits. Second-class citizens, that's your psych patient. Out of sight, out of mind. They can't complain, and even if they did, nobody would listen. Yeah, they're treated no better than animals. Holly shook her head. It seemed like it was more serious than only the lights going out. Everything had been affected. What was going on? Still, she didn't want to get caught, and she crept back to her room. Holly stared at her empty bed and the sheets strewn on the floor. Though the dryness in her throat had been sated, her head was still throbbing. She could use some painkillers, something to clear the pain and help her think better. It's not as if her room buzzer worked anymore, so getting a nurse wasn't so easy. Anyway, she didn't want to draw attention. It was as if the whole place was all shut down. She paced the room, racking her brain. Maybe she could get what she needed from the pharmacy. There'd been no one there right now. She'd be able to slip in and help herself. The staff would be overwhelmed with the more severely ill patients. They wouldn't realize if she had free rein if she just kept quiet and discreet. Her heart was beating wildly in her chest. It took her a moment to realize that it wasn't the usual anxiety and nerves that caused her heart rate to rise. This was excitement. If she could make it to the pharmacy without them clocking her, she could get to other places. Did this mean she could go outside? Leave, even? It was as if the universe had given her something she'd never dared to even hope for before. An opportunity. A glimmer of hope flickered in her chest. She perched on the edge of the bed, eyes flitting about, her mind racing 10 to the dozen. If they caught her, things would deteriorate fast. Leaving her room during curfew hours would mean punishment, and more drugs. She would lose what little freedoms she'd claimed. Her progress would be lost, and she'd be back to spending her days in solitary confinement. It had been too many years since she'd last had to make a decision. They normally made all decisions, from when to wake up, to what to eat, to what to do. Now she found herself faced with having to choose, and she felt clueless. But right now was when she needed to be at her best. There was no way she was going to allow herself to let this chance slip past her. It was risky, but she was prepared to take that risk. She had to leave. Before she could change her mind, she moved to the tiny closet her room offered and studied the contents. Over the years, her mom had sent clothes and books for every missed Christmas and birthday. Holly had given most of them away to other patients. Or the staff had decided they weren't suitable, confiscating any items she could use to harm herself. That left her options limited. Running a hand over the few cotton t-shirts and sweatpants, the thoughts bubbled up. Stay and be a good patient. Maybe someday they'll allow you to visit home. Leave, and if they catch you, you're dead. Well, you might as well be dead. She peered out the window. Heavy clouds obscured the stars, and with no lights, she could only just make out the drift of descending snowflakes. It was cold out there, and she knew she needed to bundle up. Shaking her head at the paltry collection, she reached for the warmest of her clothes. She'd have to find a coat elsewhere. Her mind went to the staff that were still working. They would have jackets and gloves. Everything she needed to stay warm. She grabbed several shirts and pulled them on. Layers were the best she could do right now, and she would make it work. Already a chill was creeping into the room. Her eyes landed on her beat-up sneakers. They were grayer than the pristine white they had once been. Ugly things meant for such a place as a mental hospital. Shoving her feet into the shoes, she glanced about the room. There was nothing else that she wanted to take with her. Holly squared her shoulders before steeling herself. She just needed to open the door and step back out. Holly. With swift steps, Holly tiptoed down the hall. The power could come back at any moment, so she needed to be quick if her mission was to be successful. Strange silhouettes danced along the walls as she moved along. Distantly, she heard a man groaning. Somebody far off was crying. Normal sounds in the place that had been her home for almost 3 decades. She'd gotten accustomed to the sounds of other people slipping away from reality, while she'd struggled so hard to cling to it. Unlike them, she refused to let her mental health deteriorate to a point where she would lose her identity, though she didn't always win that battle. Muttering nurses rounded the corner, oblivious to Holly's presence. Both had trays of little plastic cups in their hands. She was all too familiar with the pills of all sizes and colors that the cups contained. But it couldn't already be time for meds. Her heart stopped for a second, eyes widening before she ducked into the shadows. "Not everyone will be happy about this," one nurse said. "But what else are we supposed to do? Having them all awake with no power is just going to lead to chaos." "None of us want that. We need to sedate them. We can sort the formalities later." The second nurse let out a huff as they stepped into the room across from the darkness that concealed Holly. She screwed up her eyes, just able to make out their figures, watching as one moved toward a bed. Holly knew the woman they were attending. Barbara was a challenging patient on the best of days, and often violent. Last month, a young orderly on his first day had ended up with a bloodied nose just because he'd smiled at her too kindly one morning. Being woken just to take more drugs would surely lead to an outburst, which would mean more nurses and orderlies being summoned. If Holly stuck around, they would see her. She needed to keep moving, so she turned and headed toward the smaller stairwell. The squelch of her sneakers against the linoleum floors made her wince, but she kept going. Because of its small size and being part of the original design of the building, this stairwell wasn't used as often as the others, which were more open and in the middle of the floors. Here, she was hopeful she could leave her floor without being detected. She moved stealthily, feeling along the walls until her hands touched the cold metal of the door. Just as she heaved a sigh, she heard a scream from Barbara's room and the sound of running footsteps. Flinching against the high-pitched squeak of the door, Holly slipped into the stairwell. It was pitch black. Not even a sliver of light from outside reached the cramped space. The stairs were steep, remnants of a bygone era that had little care for those with spinning heads. She had to lean against the wall as she stared into the depths below. Carefully, she moved away from the door, using her foot to test out the space before she took a step, feeling the anxiety beginning to rise. Thoughts of falling, of getting caught, or worse, the doors being locked and her becoming trapped, filled her mind. She closed her eyes and focused on calming her breathing. Gradually, the panic retreated. Not so much that it was gone, but enough that her mind could focus on the task at hand. She needed to get to the main floor, where the pharmacy was located. That meant navigating halls and wings she wasn't familiar with. Despite the years spent trapped within these walls, they'd rarely given her the freedom to wander. Not so she could explore and make sense of the hospital. She crept down the steps, clinging to the handrail, thankful for the cold metal that bit into her palms. Holly hated the confined space of the stairwell and was suddenly eager for this part of her mission to be over. It would be impossible to hide if anyone was to throw open the doors. Any nurse or patient could stumble across her, and they'd catch her mid-escape. Success was sweet when she reached the landing. She groped about, searching for either a door or the next set of stairs. As her hand felt along the wall, she found a doorknob. Without hesitation, she pulled it, and the door opened with a low squeak. She edged out of the door and into a wide hallway. Nurses called to one another from further down the hall, causing her to flatten herself against the door as it closed behind her with a soft click. It was lighter here, enough that she could almost make out the room numbers. Low groans reached her ears, along with laughter and talking. More people were awake and active on this level, and her mind returned to her room. She should go back. It wasn't too late to stop this insanity before it got her into trouble. Nobody would be any the wiser. She rubbed her eyes and peered into the darkness. Determination was quick to replace her feelings of doubt, though it did little to propel her feet forward. Sucking in a breath, she took one step, then two down the hall. Sounds of laughter from a room drew her attention. A young woman sat in her bed, head cocked to the side as she nodded along to some unseen figure or thing. Her cackles sending chills racing down Holly's back. This wasn't where she needed to be. If the patients here were that out of touch with reality, she must be on the secure wing, where they monitored the patients 24/7. At least Holly had one foot firmly placed in reality. Most of the time. Though here, the nurses would be less open to hearing any excuses from her. A searing pain shot across her head. A stark reminder she needed meds. She moved away from the disturbed woman's door. Slinking through the shadows, she peeked into each of the rooms. Some held sleeping bodies. Others, people sitting and staring into nothing. In one, a man was standing still as a statue on his bed, his head bent back, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Without meaning to, she tilted her head upwards, straining to see what he was staring at. But there was nothing there. Distracted by the man's hallucinations, she almost didn't hear the approaching footsteps and the low chatter of more nurses. No options were available to her other than to scoot into a patient's room, or she'd run straight into them. Holly dodged into the room next to where the man was standing on his bed. Going into his room seemed like it would end in trouble. As she entered, she let her eyes roam about. She was alone, and she breathed a sigh of relief. With her back pressed against the wall by the door, she listened to the nurses grumbling about the lack of power and the weather as they bustled past. The snow wasn't bad enough to warrant any backup plans to be enacted. Yet. But they hoped they might squeeze an extra day out of the weekend. Once they'd got to the end of the hall and she could no longer hear their chatter, she let out a sigh. Closing her eyes, she let her shoulders sag. When she opened them, she jumped. A face, mere inches from hers. The protruding eyes of a man stared at her. His expression was childlike wonder, though he seemed to be in his 60s. She barely got a hand to her mouth in time to keep her gasp of shock. "Margie, you came!" the man squealed. He was confused. Her eyes shot to the door. Already, his glee was bound to attract attention. She'd have to do her best to keep him quiet. "I did," she whispered, "but we have to be quiet." The man pouted, the happiness at her presence quickly melting from his face. He frowned at her. "You aren't Margie." In a blink, his anger had turned to rage as his eyes burned with emotion. "I'm telling on you that you're here." His voice was low, but taunting. "You can't hurt me this time." "I don't want to hurt you." Heavy hands landed on her shoulders, startling her. The man yanked her away from the wall. She struggled, but her thin figure was no match for his pudgy hands. He'd got at least 200 pounds on her. His round face reddened as he dragged her across the room. "I'm prepared this time," he hissed. "I won't let you get away. Then, when they see you're real, they'll stop keeping me here. They'll stop keeping Margie from me." Debating how to best play along with this, Holly didn't fight as he forced her onto the bed, though she almost gagged as his hot, acrid breath entered her nostrils. He took a step back, shuffling his hands around the covers as if he was looking for something. She sidled away from him as subtly as possible. An angry cry escaped him as he realized she'd moved. His swollen hands were on her again, only this time an unsettling, triumphant look in his eyes as he glowered down at her. Slowly, he revealed an elastic cord from his pants. Now it was her eyes that widened as he moved to slip it over her head. "You'll pay for keeping Margie from me." Gagging against the pressure on her throat, she pleaded, "Please, no, I wouldn't ever keep Margie from you. I want to help you." He paused. His eyes were wide. "Liar." The elastic tightened around her throat. Self-preservation kicked in as she clawed at his hands, her fingernails digging in hard, trying to wrench his hands from her and the tightening cord. But she wasn't strong enough. It was like he was possessed. He didn't even notice the scratches on his hands and the blood gushing from the wounds. The man was a monster. Tears tracked down her cheeks as she struggled to breathe, but still clutching at the cord, desperately trying to release it from her neck. This was it, she realized as the elastic went tighter. This was how she died. The last thing she remembered was a searing pain in her throat before she slipped into unconsciousness.
Patrick. Climbing back into his pickup, Pat shook his head. Unreal. Pat had met his fair share of morons in his time, but this one came close to trumping them all in the idiot stakes. He reached for the key and turned the ignition, heaving an audible sigh when the engine fired up. Too many cars around him were immobile, and he worried that whatever had hit these vehicles would strike his truck, and that he, too, would be stranded on the bridge. Annoyance filled him as he caught sight of the idiot father still standing next to his car. The smug look on his face had worn off. Apparently, calling Pat a pervert was only satisfying until he'd walked off. It had gone against every instinct in his body to leave. But Pat had known better than to stay. Tap, 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 tap. Still, he squirmed as he dragged his eyes away from the daughter. She seemed like a good kid, one that would suffer because of her dad. No child deserved that. They all deserved to have parents worth looking up to, parents who were doing things like saving the day and showing humility and humanity in tough situations, not having their heads so far up their asses that they couldn't recognize help when it was right in front of them. Tap, 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 tap. He could only hope that her father eventually did right by her. Turning to face the road again, the snow was heavier now as the swollen globules plopped onto his windshield. Snow would lead to ice, which would make the whole mess of the bridge that much worse for those still caught out there. He blew into his hands and rubbed them vigorously, regretful that he'd left his leather gloves up at the cabin. His fingertips felt like icicles. Leaning forward, he noted that the sky had darkened. It wouldn't be long before night settled over the city. He considered turning around and heading back to Kimberly's house. It wasn't right to leave his kids there, waiting on their mom to make it back from her job up in Portland. And if the roads up north were as bad as in Salem, it could take her several hours to make her way home. But she'd made it clear many times that she wanted as little to do with him as possible. She'd have a fit if he were there when she got home. The kids would roll their eyes and slink off, not wanting to upset their mom. No, he decided it wasn't worth the drama. They'd be fine by themselves for a few hours, by which time everything would be back to normal. He turned his attention back to his truck and the road before him. People milled about. Some were heaving their smashed cars to the side of the road. Others were shaking their heads at the ones that had stalled out. Many were sporting cuts, oblivious to the bloody mess on their clothing, shell-shocked to the sudden disaster that had just happened. Pat wasn't sure what was going on, but he wanted to get out of town. Thoughts of his cabin up above Detroit Lake filled his head again. It wasn't a terrible drive, even with snow and ice. He'd spent many a wintry day there, so he knew he could make it. Though it would be a little hairy up the old roads off the highway. Hunkered down for a few days, hell, for a few weeks. It wasn't like he had anything that needed his immediate attention. No wife. Only visitation rights for his kids, so he rarely saw them. Anyway, they were at the age they wanted nothing to do with him. And no job now that he was officially retired. An empty week of nothingness stretched out before him, tempting him to head straight up there. But he needed food. After, he'd swing by his place to collect the last of his stuff. Hopefully, Jane, his new ex-wife, wouldn't be there. Then, he could go. He'd try to make a quick call to check on the kids, but if the signal still wasn't working, he'd cruise past the house and stop by. Shifting his truck into gear, he backed up. All eyes were on him as he navigated the cars and people. It was strange to see so many broken-down cars, though a few crept through the sea of people like he was, their engines on a low rev. Older models, like his truck. Cars that had all seen better days. Something about that observation pricked the back of his mind as he crawled past the mall. People were standing outside, many looking confused. The traffic lights weren't working, nor were the streetlights. Pat was relieved that most of the vehicles were sitting still. Otherwise, the streets would be a mess. The snow had picked up in intensity and was blanketing everything, adding to the mess. Soon, people would get off work, clogging the streets as they always did. He was eager to be as far away from downtown Salem as he could be by then. He went slowly, all too aware of the eyes that followed him as he drove. Fewer cars were moving the deeper he went into Salem. Finally, he spotted the grocery store. The usually bright and welcoming neon sign was out, as though forewarning him of what to expect inside. He let out an irritated sigh. If he'd been smart and checked the weather app, he would have done the shopping earlier. But he hated smartphones and would rather read the paper like his dad. Every morning for his entire childhood, he'd find his old man at the table, paper in hand and a steaming mug of black coffee within reach. Pat had wanted the same memories for his kids. Not that it mattered now that they rarely spent time with him, other than the occasional ride home from school or weekend trips to the cabin that Kimberly reluctantly agreed to. He turned off the main road, carefully navigating the parking lot until he found a spot as far from the entrance as possible. If he was fortunate, the store would be mostly dead due to whatever power outage seemed to have hit the city. Though he guessed it wouldn't be long until people flooded the aisles, panic buying milk and bread, especially with a storm brewing. Jumping out of his vehicle, he tilted his head upwards. The darkening sky was a charcoal gray as the flurry of snow dusted his face. At his side, his fingers moved. Tap, 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 tap. Then, left, right, he whispered under his breath. When he'd been a police officer, he'd hated snow days. People became unpredictable in their behavior. Too many avoidable accidents had pulled him away from more serious police business. Not that he'd minded. Standing out in the bitter cold, directing traffic, or walking the streets had never bothered him. Not when he could remain calm for those going through a bad day. That had always been his favorite part of the job. Being somebody's rock on the worst day of their lives. No matter what he'd seen, from bloodied and broken bodies to destroyed livelihoods, he'd kept a neutral face. It didn't matter what he was responding to. He was a rock. Until he was away from the victims. Then, he'd break down. Tears for those that were hurt in ways that might never heal. Or he'd let the rage overtake him for a moment at those that thought they could get away with heinous acts. As he strode toward the store, he kept the same calm face that had served him well as a cop. People were next to their cars, most looking unsure what to do with themselves. Many held phones to the sky, as if the clouds would grant them service. He dragged out his phone and flipped it open. A relic of a time long past, much like him. The screen glared at him. Still no service. He shoved the phone back into his pocket as he stepped through the entrance. More people were milling about with carts stacked full of food, and others were standing around with bagged items at their feet and in their arms. His fingers kept up their repetitive beats. Every part of him screamed at him to turn around and leave. Tension was high as people were trying to figure out what was going on. The side eyes he received as he moved through the store unsettled him. It wouldn't take much for panic to spread like wildfire amongst the folk gathered here. He could already tell. They would let their worst fears push them to make stupid mistakes. Mistakes that he was all too familiar with. Mistakes like the one that had landed him in early retirement. As Pat moved past a balding guy in his mid-50s, their eyes met. In a flash, he was back in that moment. Back to the night that had changed his future and left him with a debilitating limp despite months of physical therapy. His body tensed as he forced his eyes away. This is the middle of Salem, he told himself. You're safe here. He didn't feel safe. Not as the man's eyes followed him. Like that driver, the young man that Pat had pulled over. His left taillight had been out, a simple, routine traffic stop to offer a warning and perhaps even point the guy in the right direction. Though nothing about the stop had been routine. From the man's dilated pupils, the sweat on his brow, to the forced smile on his thin, bloodless lips. Pat would never forget the way the man's eyes bored into him, never leaving his face even as he reached for his gun and pointed it at Pat. Not a single blink as he pulled the trigger and Pat collapsed to the ground. 3 shots fired, without even so much as a flinch from the man as he stared at Pat, watching as each bullet sliced through his leg. Then he'd got back into his car and sped off, leaving Patrick lying on the cold, wet road, bleeding from his leg and unable to drag himself up. It had been thanks to a concerned citizen who had come across the scene 5 minutes later that help arrived when it did. A dark-haired Mexican woman on her way to work. She'd found Pat struggling to crawl back to his car to radio for help, a bloody trail marking his path along the road. The woman had stayed with him until the paramedics had arrived, before they'd whisked him away from the road, and from his life as a police officer. Tap, 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 tap. Sir? Patrick flinched as the voice pulled him back to the present. He swung round, his hand already at his empty hip as he met the eyes of a man in a business suit. Wide, just like the shooter's eyes had been. The same coal black, even.
Holly. Suddenly, the pressure was gone. Holly gasped as her eyes shot open. An involuntary twitch of her body jerked her back to reality. She was alive. The man had dropped the elastic so that it hung around her neck, wiping at the tears that now stained his cheeks. She gulped down a lungful of stale air, spluttering in her eagerness to get the oxygen back into her lungs. Her hands flew to her throat, raw and sure to bruise. The man stared at her, his eyes wide and glassy, cocking his head first to the left and then to the right. "I just want Margie," he whispered. "Why can't I have her?" The man didn't seem to be a threat anymore, but she needed to keep her guard up. Her throat was on fire, and her emotions frazzled. Being brutally choked to near death felt too overwhelming, but her instinct to survive had kicked in, and she had to place all of that aside if she was to get away from this man. "Let me help you." Her voice came out ragged. He nodded slowly. Then he sank to his knees, his shoulders shuddering with the might of his sobbing. She blinked down at him, watching the tears roll down his cheeks, hesitating before moving off the bed. "Where is Margie?" she rasped. "I can see if I can get her brought here, if that would help." It was a lie, but it might be enough to settle him. Then she could slip from his room and resume her journey. Though she didn't like to tell lies and get his hopes up. She didn't see any other option. And she'd rather not have the elastic wrapped tight around her throat again. "She's gone." His voice quivered. "Without Margie, what will I do? She should be at my side." He looked up at her, his sobs quieting to snivels. He swiped his hand across his nostrils and let out a loud sniff. If it weren't because he'd almost killed her, she would feel sorry for him. "Shh." She reached out to press a hand to his cheek. "It'll be okay, but you must be quiet so we don't get caught. Tell me about your Margie." He nodded. His eyes were red and swollen. "She's my best friend. An angel. She's always been there. She'll know what to do. Find her. Don't let them keep her from me." "I'll find her." "Find her, please. I need her." His tears returned with force, and Holly's panic doubled. He was about to ruin her short-lived attempt at an escape. He would have half the ward swarming his room if he kept this up. "Margie! Margie!" he moaned. The man was rocking back and forth, subsumed in his own misery. As his large form shifted, she saw her moment of escape. She kept her eyes on him as she sidled away from him, adrenaline spiking her veins, doing her best to tread carefully and lightly. He was blessedly unaware of her movements, his mutterings following her to the door. "Margie!" Her feet inched backward as she retreated, silently, fearful he would notice she was leaving him. But he was too far gone. His sobs would return, and a nurse would sigh before marching into his room, needle in hand. She wouldn't be there for that. Screams echoed down the hall, quickly followed by running footsteps. Holly slunk into the shadows, watching as several nurses swept past her into a room several doors down. The screams didn't quieten. If anything, they seemed to turn more blood-curdling. Shouting joined the mix. Something terrible was happening. One quick glance confirmed her fears that she would have to walk past the open door of that room to get to the main stairwell that would take her to the ground floor. Unlike the smaller stairwell from before that was accessible by anyone, the main floor was only accessible through a thick metal door that was usually locked. Holly prayed the power outage had taken care of that problem, or her adventure was coming to a premature end. hands trembling as she pressed them to her sides. She needed to move before more nurses came running. The screams were growing more panicked, and it scared her what she might witness. It can't be worse than anything I've seen before. The thought wasn't as reassuring as she hoped, but it gave her the courage to pull herself from the shadows. She kept her eyes straight as she continued down the corridor, the sounds of raised voices and shrieks making her tense and pause every few seconds. Don't look. Don't look. With everyone preoccupied with whatever was happening, Holly carried on, her gaze locked on the double metal doors that would lead her off the ward, flinching at every sound. She stopped when she reached the room. The screams had quieted to wails, but the voices had grown louder in their panic. Her feet refused to move from the spot. Curiosity, or maybe the need to witness the terrible things that were happening. She swiveled her head to the left. A young woman, no older than 19 or 20, stood on her bed, a pair of scissors in her hand. Blood dripped from her arms to the mattress, staining the white sheets crimson. Around her, nurses were trying to coax her down. But if any got too close, the scissors bit into her skin again, another wail adding to the night. For a moment, the woman's eyes met Holly's. They stared at each other before a smile pulled at the woman's lips. Then she turned away, tilting her head. Not before Holly had seen the pain in the young woman's gaze. The scissors lifted again, and Holly gasped, her mouth agape. A fresh cut was added to the woman's collection as more of her blood spurted onto the sheets at her feet. Suddenly, her eyes clouded over, her consciousness being dragged away right in front of Holly's eyes. She swayed on her legs before the nurses jumped forward to catch her. Her eyes fluttered closed, and for a second, she looked serene. The scissors slipped from her hand, bouncing to the floor. A nurse immediately snatched them up. Holly pulled her gaze away as the woman's body crumpled onto the bed. Nothing good would come from what the woman had done. There had been purpose to her strokes with the scissors. Holly had seen the same trapped look in her own reflection as she saw in the woman's face. Like her, the woman had been caught in a cycle of hurt and pain. But unlike her, the woman could not carry the burden. A salty wetness stung Holly's eyes as she forced her feet to move. She couldn't bear to stand there any longer, nor could she risk a nurse finding her there. This was her only chance at escape. Holly didn't know if the woman would succeed in her pathetic attempt to end her life, or if the nurses and doctors would save her. If they did, they would keep her locked away, forever labeling her a threat to herself and others. To condemn her to a tiny, cell-like room for the rest of her miserable life. As she walked toward the exit, Holly's fingers found the jagged scar that stretched across her wrist. Not as knotted as it had been all those years ago, when it had been so fresh and angry, yet still serving as her reminder of the desperation she'd once felt. Her lungs tightened at the painful memories of her early days in the hospital. For a moment, her vision turned black as she tried to dislodge the thoughts and feelings that she thought she'd buried. She was just a child when they'd wrenched her from her mom and dad. Usually, she pushed the memories away, deep down into the murky depths of her mind. But when they reared up, they wrapped around her like a suffocating cloth, threatening to drag her back to the hell that was her childhood. Lurching forward, she placed her hands on the cold metal of the doors. It was a shock to her system, and enough to pull her back, but she quickly steadied herself, and with a swift heave, she yanked the door. It let out a low groan, but opened. Relief pooled in her stomach. one less obstacle in her path. Without another thought, she pushed through the doors, finally leaving the ward.
Patrick. "The machines are down," the man told Patrick. It took him a moment for the words to sink in. Then another moment for his heart to stop racing as he calmed his breathing. This man standing before him wasn't about to shoot him or start anything. He was trying to be a nice person, saving Pat the wasted time of traipsing through the store, only to be told there was no way for the cashier to process the order. "I have cash," Pat replied. "Usually they can still accept that, but thanks." Tap, 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 tap. The man shrugged, his attention already on the parking lot. Pat followed the man's gaze. The snow was now coming down in cookie-sized globules, sticking to the parked cars and collecting on people's faces as they hunched their shoulders and dived into their vehicles. The light was fading, and if he wanted to leave the store before nightfall, he'd have to be quick. Though turning to face the dark innards of the sprawling grocery outlet, he doubted that was possible. A tense solemnity filled the store. It felt strange not to hear Muzak sounding through the speakers, and the absence of light from the overhead fluorescent strips added to the weirdness. Moving through the huddles of customers milling about, Pat took the first empty aisle he came to. He squinted against the dark. Reaching for his cell, he peered at the lack of bars before clicking on the flashlight. The pale beam from its weak light cast strange shadows on the endless bottles of soda that lined the aisle. He scrunched his nose at the soda aisle, considering his options. Though he had an ancient generator up at his cabin, he was starting to doubt he could make it there. Not if the roads were already covered in snow. With darkness, ice would form, and leaving town would be a mess. If the power was out for more than a few days, fresh produce would be at risk of going bad. Even with the snow and freezing temperatures, fresh food had a limited lifespan. Canned goods and dried foods would be his best bet. Cases of bottled water, too. Standing there, he made a mental list of what to grab. Things that would last and be easy to eat if the power stayed out. Cans of chili, various beans, tinned meat, crackers, packets of nuts and dried fruit, coffee, and water. If he had the time, and people hadn't already stripped the shelves, powdered milk and pancake mix. He was worried that by now, most of the things on his wish list would be gone, and that the people who had got here earlier had already had the foresight to grab such items. Tap, 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 tap. He was wasting time standing here. With a sigh, he left the soda behind. Several people were picking their way through the aisles, cell phones lighting their paths. Most were carrying gallons of milk. Some even carried enormous tubs of ice cream, items that wouldn't last long without refrigeration, even with the cold weather. Or without power. It was as if they expected to step outside the store and find that the power had come back on in their homes. Though, perhaps it would soon, he thought. But then he remembered all the disabled vehicles and the frustrated looks on the faces of those wandering about the parking lot, and earlier on the bridge. Something about it tickled the back of his mind, giving him pause for thought. In his head, he ran through the various scenarios they'd trained him for. Not just his days at the police academy, but his time in the army, too. His mind was whirling, and his fingers going 10 to the dozen. No, it's just a power outage, he reassured himself. Still, his mind wouldn't stop spinning with thoughts of attacks and riots. It wouldn't take much for someone to knock out the power, local or international. It was always a fear that he'd had during his years of service, ever since he saw action in the Gulf War. And the hatred in the eyes of the terrorists, something that still haunted him at night. He'd seen that same hatred here in Salem, those he'd pulled over in their run-down vehicles or arrested for petty offenses. Hatred was all too rampant in the world, which made it all the easier to imagine this was an attack, something far more horrific than just a power outage. Tap, 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 tap. The intensity of his tapping fingers finally calmed his mind. It will be okay, he told himself. Everything usually had a funny way of working itself out in the end. Even if it rarely ended up the way he'd hoped, he knew he had to trust the process, or stop worrying so much about things which he couldn't control, as his therapist told him every time they met. He willed his mind away from thoughts of an attack. Even worse, a nuclear attack. There would be plenty of time for that later when he was driving to his cabin, or as he settled in for several days of solitude. Until then, he needed supplies. Non-perishable food items needed to be his priority. Passing an older couple bickering over pork chops in the meat section, he made his way toward the canned food aisle. He had to use his phone's light several times, though he realized he should preserve the battery. His daughter had taken his charger out of the truck, and he'd yet to get around to replacing it. Hopefully, the cabin would have power, but he didn't want to add any extra pull on the generator unless he needed to. It was already on its last legs. To his surprise, most of the canned foods looked untouched, confirming his suspicions that people weren't at the panic-buying stage yet. Though, that would begin soon. Work would let out in less than 30 minutes. He needed to be gone by then. The store was close enough to the government office buildings of Salem that people could walk over to grab things while waiting for the snow to pass or rides to show up for them. Then, chaos would quickly descend, and panic would push people to act in ways that were dangerous for everyone. He'd seen it too many times to count. Tap, 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 tap. With one hand, he massaged both sides of his jaw, at the same time chiding himself about the constant clenching of his teeth. Now he could focus on the collection of canned chilies before him, thankful for the distraction. His mind all too easily wandered to the past, to situations out of his control, and it would take some strength of willpower to drag his thinking back to the present. Shootings, ambushes, and attacks for the last 3 decades had left him worn down. Not just worn down, beyond exhausted. Wary of most situations, several therapists had labeled it as post-traumatic stress disorder turned obsessive-compulsive disorder. PTSD and OCD. Great. He ticked all the boxes for a damaged man. His need to glean some sense and logic from the world of uncontrollable tragedies that plagued him. He hadn't always drummed his right index finger as if he had a nervous twitch, or the dozen other little ticks that controlled his life. The very things that had pushed Jane, his latest ex-wife, to her breaking point. Well, that and the realization that he couldn't support her in the manner she wanted to be supported. As a retired cop, he didn't have the money she'd been hoping for. Not to mention alimony from his previous divorce and kids he was still supporting. They always came first in his book. Something else that she'd never been able to live with. Tap, 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 tap. He hadn't meant to let his mind wander to Jane, yet there it was, fixated on her. Of his 3 failed marriages, his third was perhaps his most frustrating. It wasn't as messy of a split as with Kimberly, his kid's mother, or as cold as his first divorce. This one had been too emotional, with Jane tearful and frantic throughout the entire process, from demanding they sell the house they'd shared to deciding that she wanted it in the divorce. When she was told they'd have to sell it as per her lawyer's advice, more tears had sprung up. After enough tantrums, Pat had caved in and let her keep it. On the proviso, she let him keep his paltry pension, to which she'd reluctantly agreed. Just thinking about the negotiations that went into their divorce settlement had Patrick reaching for a row of uneven cans. He straightened them, lining them up so that their labels with pictures of bowls of steaming chili faced directly straight at the consumer. This gave him some relief and enough distraction to push thoughts of his latest ex-wife from his head. Until he remembered he needed to go to the house first to pick up the last of his stuff. No doubt she'd be there and would have something to say to him. She'd already spent the last weeks spewing out question upon question at him about the property now that she'd taken it on. She wouldn't have the first clue what to do in a power outage. Tap, 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 tap. He might have to spend more time there than he'd planned, helping to ensure she had what she needed, before heading over to the cabin after taking the last of his things. This should save him an unnecessary trip back into town. And he would finally be done with her, though he suspected it would take considerably more effort to get her out of his life. Not that he was sure that's what he wanted. 7 solitary days stretched out in front of him. He longed for the quiet solitude of his cabin. "Help!" A woman's voice pierced the quiet. In a rising panic, the word came out as a screech. Dragged from his thoughts, Pat tensed, craning his neck to check across the aisles. The shout had come from several rows away. Zipping up his jacket, he abandoned the job of deciding which chili to drop in the trolley.
Holly. Relief mixed with fear as Holly trod quietly, flinching at how her footsteps echoed through the hall. Doors that led to offices lined the hallway. She stepped toward one, glancing at the name on the door. Moving along, she continued to read the names of the doctors to calm her racing heart and distract her mind. Curiosity propelled her forward. Her psychiatrist, Dr. Burke's office, must be here somewhere, and she wasn't working today. Holly had never seen her file. It would be there, in Dr. Burke's room, containing medical notes that would detail her entire medical history. More information about her mental health than even she was aware of. They would also hold the letter from the judge that outlined her punishment for the fire and everything else. She wanted to see them, learn more about herself, and to fill in all the strangely blank spots that had appeared recently. While she had periods of being more in control of herself and her emotions, there were still times when irrationality won out. And times she couldn't remember, like earlier that day, and whatever had led to the fog and pain. It was at the end of the corridor when she saw the name. Holly froze, staring at the lettering. Dr. Vera K. Burke, M.D., Medical Director. This could be her chance. A frisson of excitement sparked through her as she tried the doorknob. It was unlocked, which struck her as strange. Dr. Burke was a very organized woman who hated anything out of order. Holly had learned that early when she'd been late. It had led to a sharp look and a lecture on the importance of establishing routines and sticking to them. Holly stepped into the dark office. She blinked against the dark, waiting for her eyes to adjust. She could just make out the neat desk and the shelves along the wall lined with heavy books. As she moved further into the office, she spotted the twin pair of tall filing cabinets. Unlike the door, though, they were locked. She tugged on them before letting out a disappointed huff. She should have known better. She turned around and stared at the desk. Maybe she should let it go. Leave and continue her mission to find meds and food. Yet an all-consuming desire to see what was in her notes would not go away. She had to find a way to get her file. Holly needed to see what was in it. She needed to learn everything about what they'd done to her since she'd arrived. This was the first time she'd had this desire. Previously, she'd always assumed that her medical notes belonged to the hospital and her doctors. They weren't for her to read. None of her business. She shuddered. This might not be the most logical pit stop, but for now, she didn't care. She wasn't leaving without her file. For the first time she could remember, she felt like the confident girl that had wanted to become a detective. The spirited teenager who had convinced her parents to let her attend the camp. A soft smile pulled at her lips as she stepped over to the desk. The key must be somewhere. With swift movements, she opened each drawer in the desk, rifling through the contents. But the only useful thing she came across was a phone. Holly stared at it. This must be Dr. Burke's work line that she'd seen her frowning at many times in their sessions. So why hadn't she taken it with her? A shiver of foreboding ran through her. Dr. Burke might be somewhere around and could walk in at any moment. No, she's off. Holly considered stuffing the phone back in the drawer but tapped the screen, casting an eerie blue light across the room. With the flashlight in her hand, Holly turned toward the bookshelves. As she ran her fingers along the spines of Dr. Burke's books, she let her gaze wander. Most of the titles talked about psychology, hefty tomes that were impressive to look at. She wondered how many of them her doctor had read. Probably most, considering the rigidness that made up Dr. Burke, with her seemingly encyclopedic knowledge of everything. Out of the corner of her eye, she spotted a photo sitting on the desk. It looked out of place in the office, one of the few personal items in an otherwise sparse room. It was a wedding photo. Dr. Burke, her sharp features softened by her makeup, her blonde hair loose, not the usual tight knot at the base of her neck that she sported around the hospital. A broad smile pulled at her thin lips, while her ice-blue eyes, still behind the familiar frames, were on the handsome man at her side. She looked pretty and young in the picture. Nothing like the frosty, middle-aged woman Holly was used to. A familiar yearning for a life missed, of moments robbed from her, weighed down on her. She should have had her own wedding day, a career, and an office. Holly swiped at her eyes as she set down the photo. Her gaze caught on a paperback book sitting there. It was out of place. Its pages were yellowed, and the spine broken, as though it had been thumbed through often. Holly picked it up, glancing at the title and author. She could just make out the lettering in the thin light from the phone. Psychiatry and the Brain, by Dr. Jacques Burke. This must be some relative of hers. It was strange, imagining that her therapist had any family. The woman seemed too cold. Guilt pricked Holly at having such an unkind thought. She leafed through the pages. The cool, musty air wafted in her face. Something slipped onto the floor with a metallic ping. She bent to pick up the object. A small metal key. She stared at it for a moment before glancing at the filing cabinet, shaking her head. This seemed too good to be true, but she moved to the cabinet and slipped in the key. It unlocked easily. For a moment, she stood staring at the alphabetically ordered files. A low scream sounded in her ears, reminding her they could catch her at any moment. Her eyes darted to the W's. Winters. Holly. It was a thick file, which made sense for the number of years she'd been there. Holding it unnerved her, but she felt the urge to read it, right there and then. After a moment, she couldn't stop herself and flipped the file open. A picture immediately drew her attention. Wide eyes with deep purple circles around them pierced her gut. They'd taken it on the day they'd admitted her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at this younger version of herself. Just like that, she was 14 again. The warm sun beat down on her as she stood staring at the building that would be her high school in just 2 short months, when fall hit and the nights turned cold. A smile tugged at her lips as she glanced about at the other students that were making their way up the steps. Some looked as nervous as she felt, while others seemed lost in thought. All looked eager for the activities the school was hosting that day. Ever since the nice detective that had helped them after her dad's accident, she'd wanted to study law. She'd devoured every book at the library several blocks from their little house, staying up late to read. Under the covers, with a flashlight in hand, she pretended she was solving cases and helping bring good to the world. She felt it in her bones that this was what she was meant to do. Before she'd even finished middle school, she'd been eager to start high school and be on her way to making her dreams come true. When she'd seen the flyer for the camp that the police were putting on, she knew she had to go. Several sheriffs from local precincts would be there, showcasing their skills to the interested students. No! Holly couldn't stop the exasperated sigh that escaped her at her mom's crossed arms and a stern frown. Ever since the accident, her mom had been stricter, insisting that Holly didn't wander too far from home or stay out past dusk, as if there was some evil out there waiting to attack her, leaving her confined to a bed, unable to move. Like her dad. "Mom, this is about my future. It's just a camp." "You're 14. You don't need to be so worried about the future." That was all her mom had to say then, but weeks of begging had worn her down. Holly had seen to it. Just a few more days, and she would have her mom's signature on that permission slip. She even turned to her older sister, Heather. In exchange for babysitting her nephews for free, Heather had agreed to talk to Mom. "Don't hold your breath," her sister had grumbled, bouncing the baby on her hip. "Mom's stubborn. She only listens to one person." Dad. That had given Holly the idea to go to him. He couldn't move the lower half of his body anymore, and he had limited use of the upper. Not since the accident. He could still listen and talk, though his speech came out slurred, and it took him a while to string words into a sentence. But he would listen, and Holly knew he would support her. He always had her back. "I'll be back at 3, her mom had told her as she dropped her off. She could still remember the feeling of triumph that morning as she'd slipped from the car to enter the school gates. It had felt so right to be there, like she was finally gaining some control over her life. 4 more years, and her life would fully be hers. She'd be at college, studying criminal justice and living on her own, without her parents or sister to boss her about. Her steps had carried her into the school's gym, where the secretary had smiled brightly at her whilst checking her in, handing her a folder of papers and directing her toward a group. Holly couldn't remember when she'd first seen him or if she'd even noticed him at all. She'd been too lost in the excitement. "You look ready to learn," he'd said to her with a wink she'd thought nothing of. She'd smiled at him with barely a glance in his direction, clutching the folder they'd given her to her chest. She'd nodded politely, her eyes momentarily catching on his badge. Then they whisked her away, all thoughts of him falling from her mind. It was less than 30 seconds that she had spent in his company. With nothing more than a distracted nod, she had scarcely acknowledged him. In the days, weeks, and years to come, she would comb over this moment, searching for any signs of what was to come, of what he would do to her in just a few hours, of how he would destroy her life. But there were no clues, no matter how hard she looked, no matter from what angle she examined the facts. Nothing stood out to her. She was wearing faded jean shorts and a baggy t-shirt. The top had been her sister's and was still too big on Holly's thin frame. Her Converse shoes were scuffed and covered in dirt, and her hair had been pulled into a braid that hung down her back. She looked younger than her 14 years. She remembered his smile as he asked her if she could help him with something. Thinking nothing of it, she followed him. Calloused hands on her shoulders led her away from the others. His pine scent, sharp and overwhelming, lingered in the air. He took her to a dark closet, dusty and forgotten, with old gym mats that let up a cloud of dust when he forced her down. Tears in her eyes as his hand smothered her mouth, cutting off her sobs and cries. Then came the pain. A never-ending, biting pain. A heaviness unlike anything she'd ever felt. That feeling of wrongness as his hot breath had dampened the hair next to her ear. If he'd said anything, she couldn't remember. From the moment his heavy hands had landed on her shoulders in the hallway, her mind had panicked. She remembered his fingers digging into her shoulder that left bruises she would stare at for the days to come. He was an officer of the law, just like the man who had helped her family, somebody she was supposed to trust. Mom had never warned her about the evil that lurked in the shadows of someone's smile. The glint of a man's eye that meant he wanted to touch you in a dark room. When he'd finished, he left her there, curled in a ball, crying into the dusty mat. The pain pulsed through her, as did the shame. In those minutes that came after, she couldn't understand what had happened. Her mind had spun. When she tried to put words to what had just happened between them, she stuttered. Eventually, she sat up, pulled her shorts back up, and wiped her face. It felt like she'd left her body as she'd stood and brushed the dust from her clothes. Her movements were automatic. She stepped from the closet into a silent hall, flinching at every sound as she scurried to the closest bathroom, locking herself inside a stall. There she stayed until it was time to meet her mom. Quietness had overtaken her as she slunk through the school. She didn't want to see him again, nor for him to see her. And she hadn't. Thankfully, she made it to her mom's old station wagon with no one noticing her. Her mom had been too distracted to notice the quiet that was her daughter. The next day, she pretended to be sick. And the day after. Her mom paid little attention and hadn't asked why she no longer wanted to go to the camp she'd begged her to attend. Too busy dealing with her husband's rapid decline to realize she was losing her youngest daughter as well. Just as Holly was starting to forget and rewrite what had happened, it turned out that he had left her with more than only mental scars. The first month had slipped by, and she hadn't noticed when her period didn't come, not giving it a thought. She'd learned about sex and health education the year before, giggling and blushing with her friends as their teacher had frowned at them. But she didn't understand what had happened that day, not until the next month, and her period still hadn't come. School was starting next week, and she was supposed to be getting new shoes, ones that would look nice, as her mom had said. Instead, she stood in a row of the grocery store she'd never been down before. She stared at the packages before her, blinking, trying not to cry, one hand pressed against her flat stomach. 20 minutes later, she had her answer. She curled around herself on her bed, crying soundlessly for hours as she relived the horror of that moment. Fear of what her parents would do to her kept her quiet. She couldn't stop remembering her sister's pregnancies, and of the way she'd expanded so much that she'd barely been able to walk at the end. Yet still, she couldn't believe this would be her in a few months. School started, and she said nothing. Even as her pants didn't fit any longer, and her shirts pulled tight against the swell of her belly. She'd stolen her dad's shirts, ignoring the snickers of the other girls. Tears were constantly in her eyes. Teachers noticed and told her counselor, who wrote it off as freshman blues. Holly thought she could hide. She thought she could pretend it wasn't happening, that if she didn't tell anyone, then it wouldn't be real. After all, she didn't think what had happened counted. Her teacher had made sex out to be something wonderful. Everyone acted like babies only came from love and happiness, not pain and misery. The anger grew in her, and the darkness swirled around her. No one paid her any attention. No one noticed the shattered girl that was falling to pieces. They didn't seem to care that something was wrong. The world kept spinning for everyone but her. She hated everyone. The man that had done this to her, her mom who didn't notice, and her sister who was too busy to care. Her dad was dying from a work accident and couldn't notice her, but she still hated him too. But most of all, she hated herself. Just when she thought things couldn't get worse, her mom walked in as she was getting dressed. Her mom's eyes widened as they landed on her stomach. Holly froze. "How?" her mom asked. Holly hadn't understood the question. Surely her mom knew. Then the tears had come. The screaming, the anguish, and finally the accusations. That she hadn't been careful. That she hadn't heeded warnings to protect herself. Then, silence. Holly. Her mom didn't speak to her for weeks after discovering her secret. Not a glance spared for her daughter while she stomped about the house, never staying long in one spot. That had been worse than the screaming and tears. It had torn at Holly, making her shrink even further into herself. Then, Holly overheard the conversation. It was late at night, her parents whispering in their room as she had slipped into the kitchen for a glass of water. Her dad's deep voice had halted her steps. She crept outside their door, barely breathing. "Go gentle on her, Pearl," her dad said. "She's still our child, and she needs our support." "She got herself pregnant," her mom replied. "At 14. "Did you ask her about the father?" Holly had told no one about that day at the camp. "I thought I raised her better than this," her mom said. "Don't beat yourself up, Pearl. Accidents happen." "No, they don't," her mom scoffed. "I thought she had a good head on her shoulders, that she would go somewhere with her life. Yet here she is, throwing it all away. And for some boy that I'm sure won't even bother to stick around." The tears choked her. That her own parents thought so low of her had hurt more than anything. That they could whisper about her instead of talking to her, instead of being there for her, had shattered her heart. She had disappointed them. What parents wouldn't be dismayed? But she hadn't known they would blame her. Her mind went to the man again, the one who had done this to her. She didn't even know his name. He was responsible. Surely he could help, right? He'd want to know that she was having his child. Maybe he would take it and she could go back to her life. Hope filled her at the thought. She would find him and talk to him. He would take the child, and then it would be like nothing had happened. Nobody would even need to know. She would go on with her life. College could still be on the cards. In that moment, the excitement and hope were intoxicating. The next morning, she went to the principal, eager to have her investigation underway. Only she was immediately met with hostility. The elderly principal had stared down his nose at her, demanding to know why she was asking after a chief of police, wanting to know why she thought a man as important as him would want anything to do with her. In the end, she'd left deflated. That was when the first dark thoughts had circled her mind. Yet still, she'd clung to hope. To the prospect of solving all of this by just locating the man that had done this to her. "We need to talk," her mom said several days later, finally breaking her silence. "We need to figure out everything." The teary conversation would never leave Holly's mind. Her mom had asked so many questions, wanting to know everything. At first, Holly stayed quiet. But slowly, she revealed what had happened. Her mom's face had grown ashen, shaking her head at every word that left Holly's mouth, her own lips pressed into a thin line. Wordlessly, she'd left Holly sitting at the table, her head in her hands, stunned to silence. Hours later, curled up in bed, her mom came to her. She sat by her and ran her hands through her hair, soothing her for the first time. Again, hope sprouted. "I'm so sorry, honey. What you must have gone through. What you must be going through," her mom whispered. "We can't let him get away with this," she said. "I don't care who he is. We will get his badge number." Except they didn't. The school never believed her story. They closed ranks and gave nothing away. That was when whispers started in the hallways and the muffled giggles and stares. The baggy clothes she wore suddenly made sense. Even her so-called friends distanced themselves, shunning her in the classroom. She hated the whispers, the looks, the assumption that she'd asked for this, that she'd wanted this, even done this on purpose. But above all else, she hated the way no one wanted to help her. Nobody wanted to hear her side of the story. They'd all labeled her a slut. Still, she clung to hope, and that once the baby came, she could get her life back and get back to normal. Soon enough, that day came. Pain. An agonizing pain, unlike anything she'd known before, punching her in the stomach. Her mom rushed her to the hospital, holding her hand, brushing her hair back, and whispering calming words. After what seemed like an eternity, the pain suddenly stopped. "Congrats, it's a boy," the doctor had said, setting the bundle on her chest. Laying in the hospital bed, alone, she stared at the baby across the room, sleeping soundly, as though his existence hadn't broken everything. She remembered staring at the baby. A boy. Like his father, she'd thought. Would he grow up and do the same thing? Would he hurt her just as much as his father had? She'd stared at him. She couldn't even bring herself to touch him. Her mom had taken him then, beaming down at his face. Things didn't improve when she got back home. Holly had hoped she could return to normal after his birth, that she could forget her son. But everyone kept pushing him at her, insisting that she hold him and give him love. She couldn't. And with the days, her mental state deteriorated, and she became more listless. Despite the coaxing by her mother, she refused to hold her baby. She couldn't even look at him. She gagged when she changed him and glared when she fed him. Resentment grew thick every time she heard his cries. Her body ached and hurt. But the heaviest pain was in her head. She now bore the mental scars that proved violence had brought his existence into being. And all this time, the baby's father carried on with his life as normal, blissfully unaware that her life lay in pieces. She could start her freshman year again, but she'd be behind. It wouldn't look good on her reports. College might not happen. Not when she had a child to care for. Anger, dark and heavy, settled around her. She spent more time in bed, her eyes squeezed shut, listening to her father's deep cough worsening, while her mother's whispers grew more intense. The baby cried nonstop, always wanting and needing. But she had nothing left to give. This wasn't the life she wanted. Then, one day, her father's condition had deteriorated. "The doctor's coming," her mom told her. "I need you to watch him." Holly looked at her mother and shook her head. She'd never been alone with her son before. She didn't want this. Her mom told her she'd be okay. Reluctantly, she'd agreed. The tiny baby cried the entire time, screaming and wailing in her arms. His hatred of her, burning bright and undeniable, penetrated her gut. When the doctor left, she all but threw the sobbing child into her mom's outstretched arms. The anger in her mother's eyes pierced through her. Without a word, Holly turned around and ran off, ignoring her mom's calls as she left the house, letting the door slam behind her. Her mind had been foggy, but she'd been sure of one thing. She wanted others to know her torment, for them to suffer as she had. It was early evening when she'd stood staring at the place that had allowed this to happen to her. She barely remembered walking through the empty halls until she came to the closet, the place where it had happened. She stared at the dusty mats for what seemed like hours, though in reality it was only minutes. And she reached for the matches she'd taken from the kitchen back home. Stood there, unflinching, she lit them, one by one, letting them drop to the mat, listening to their hiss as they hit the dust and the fabric. With vacant eyes, she stared at the mesmerizing flames as the heat warmed her face, all consumed by the spectacle, unable to move, not wanting to. Later, she overheard an officer telling her mom that the janitor had found her dropped to her knees, staring at the fire she'd created. In the end, the fire had done little damage other than destroying the mats and causing smoke to fill the surrounding hallway. It wasn't enough. That night, when her son's screams woke her, she'd gotten out of bed and, with rough hands, plucked him from his cot. His scrunched red face did nothing for her other than make her feel empty. She felt nothing but loneliness as she carried him into the bathroom. Muffled cries had alerted her mom as she'd burst into the room to find her daughter holding her baby under the steaming water. Her mom yanked her back, throwing her to the side before she reached for the baby. Holly's skull hit the toilet. Blood spurt from her head, leaving a trail of the sticky liquid that stained her vision red while she watched her own mother choose the baby over her. Her mom cooed over him, tears running down her face as relief overcame her when once more his cries filled the house. That had been the last night she'd spent in her home. The last time she'd seen her son, her father, and the house that had once been her refuge from the world. The rest was a blur. The courtroom, the stiff lawyer, and the frowning judge who had looked down at her with not 1 ounce of sympathy. As a minor, she couldn't decide on her future or her son's. That was down to her mother. They had given her 2 choices: detention or the hospital. Her mom chose the latter. The family agreed to take her son. Given her dad's poor health, raising a baby was proving too much for her mom, so her sister Heather agreed to raise him as her own. There, they would welcome him, giving him brothers and a family that loved him. A salty wetness filled Holly's eyes as she remembered those days and the anger she'd kept inside, that had finally thawed, though her anguish remained. But she also felt relief that she had failed, that she hadn't killed her son, who her family raised to be an amazing man.
Patrick. Cell phone in hand, Patrick rounded the corner of the fresh produce aisle. His eyes landed on an older woman on her knees, her eyes brimming with tears. 3 teenage boys towered over her. One of them, tall and spindly, a black baseball cap pulled backwards on his head, rifled through a red leather purse. The other two, maybe twins, stared down at the terrified woman. Other than them, this part of the store was empty. Pat expected to hear footsteps hurrying toward the woman's cry, but there were only muffled conversations from rows away. Nobody but Patrick had come to help the woman. Again, his hand went to his empty waist. He hated that he didn't have his 9mm Glock holstered at his side anymore. Tap, 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 tap. He moved to position himself at the mouth of the aisle. The teens were too distracted to notice him, too confident that none would pay any attention to their prey. Her tiny frame trembled as she looked up at them. Her mouth opened, but before she could get out another cry for help, one twin shifted forward. In a flash, he backhanded her in the face. She crumbled to the ground, clutching her cheek. The three boys laughed. "That's enough," Patrick said. Years of being in a position of authority put weight behind his words. He pulled his shoulders back. Even unarmed and with a bum leg, he knew how to handle the situation. De-escalate if he could. Otherwise, get the scumbags away from the victim. Her purse was his second priority. He'd like to yank it out of their hands, but first, he needed to ensure she was safe. "Who the hell do you think you are?" snarled the gangly kid holding the purse. The others snickered at his bravado. Patrick glared at them, stepping nearer. He'd encountered kids like these all the time in the force. Those that were lashing out or seeing just how far they could push the line between behaving and not. "Off-duty police officer," Pat said, placing his hand on his hip. The three quieted, exchanging looks. The second twin's eyes widened as he stared at Patrick's hip. His windbreaker jacket was enough to hide his empty belt, thankfully, but he needed to give them the illusion of carrying, of being in charge. It hit him how vulnerable he felt. His lie would carry little weight, and if they challenged him, the lie would crumble. He had no badge and nothing to prove that he could arrest them. Though they didn't need to know that. And from the quizzical looks on their faces, they weren't smart enough to realize he was lying. "Give me the purse and get out of here before I have backup here to arrest you," Pat said. "I'm feeling generous and like I don't want to spend the night buried in paperwork. But don't test me." They glanced at each other, hesitating. He expected them to do as he said. His voice carried enough weight that one of them even eyed his retreat. But then the older kid smirked, his eyes narrowing on Pat, sizing him up, as if he was debating whether he was going to let another adult push him about. Pat stood his ground, unimpressed with the three delinquents. "You ain't no cop," the kid said, a sneer pulling at his face. "Willing to test that theory?" Pat challenged. "Come on, Brandon," one twin whispered. "He looks like he could be. Besides, the old bat doesn't have any money. Let's just get out of here." Tap, 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 tap. Pat didn't want a confrontation, but he couldn't let these kids act in such a way. It would only lead them down a path he was all too familiar with. The twins looked unsure as he squared his shoulders. He might no longer be on the force, but that didn't mean he didn't know how to hold himself, even if his leg was stiff and didn't cooperate. "Seriously, dude, not worth it," the talkative twin grumbled. "Mom will kill me if I get in trouble again." His twin nodded. The tall brat with the baseball hat snorted. "I'm not scared of parents." "Or anyone." "We can change that," Pat said. Tap, 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 tap. His tone, unwavering, did the trick. He saw uncertainty in the kid's eyes. In his right eyebrow, a twitch had developed, a sign of nervousness Pat had seen before. Outnumbered, the kid would most likely succumb to peer pressure and leave. Or Pat would have no choice but to teach the kid a lesson, one that a future officer would likely thank him for. "Whatever," the kid finally said. He tossed the woman's purse at her feet with a roll of his eyes. With a nod to his friends, he turned and ran down the aisle. He glanced over his shoulder, meeting Pat's gaze as he knocked a row of glass salad dressing bottles off the shelf. Glass shattered as it hit the floor, sending the oily contents all over. The teens laughed before running off. Off to cause trouble elsewhere. Pat had half a mind to chase after them, but he didn't. "Are you okay, ma'am?" he asked the woman. He forced his bad leg to bend so he could pick up her purse. He hated the pity in her eyes when she spotted his leg and the realization that he might not have stood a chance if the teens had tried anything. Pat inwardly cringed at how obvious his condition was. No amount of therapy could fix what those gunshots had destroyed. He knew that, though acceptance didn't come any gentler. "Thank you," the woman said, accepting her purse. "You're welcome, ma'am." "Thank you again, officer." She smiled at him, rubbing her cheek. "Kids, someday they'll learn." With a shake of her head, she tottered off. Pat let out a sigh. His bad leg was shaking, reminding him he was useless. He struggled even to stand up to a bunch of teenagers. What use was he? Tap, 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 tap. Frustration overtook him as he moved back to the canned food row. He'd learned his lesson, he realized. It didn't matter that he'd spent years serving and protecting. Those days were over and well behind him. Now, he was just a civilian. The sooner he accepted that, the better. Doing his best to put the encounter behind him, Pat went about his shopping. He was too aware of the darkness, of the growing tension from the people at the front of the store, and the rising panic of the store employees. But he did his best to ignore it all as he grabbed what he would need up at the cabin. The thought of escaping everything and getting away from town was more enticing than it had ever been. He stood in line, listening to the poor cashier explain that the credit card reader was down, as was the entire system. Tap, 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 tap. He couldn't wait to be up in the cabin. Alone.
Holly. Tears streaked down Holly's cheeks as she closed the folder. Memories floated in her head of that long drive to the hospital and her first night there. Too many bad thoughts were pressing down on her, and she couldn't stop her hands from shaking. She clutched the folder tightly to her chest, sucked in a breath, and exhaled slowly. It took several moments, but she pushed the memories away. It was hiding them under a rock. This was how she'd always dealt with things. The door clicked behind her as she left Dr. Burke's office and tiptoed down the hall, coming to the wide-open front entrance area. The large reception desk was empty. Usually, several people worked the desks, and next to them, a security guard and orderlies to keep order. Seeing the empty expanse was a strange sight and made the unease crawl up her spine. She peered through the windows at the darkened grounds beyond. Snow was falling, covering the ground in a carpet of white. It wasn't the ideal weather for escaping, but she had to hope there was enough confusion that they wouldn't notice her absence for some time. And by the time they did, the snow had hidden her footprints. Her whole body shivered while she tried to calm her chattering teeth. What she was wearing was barely keeping her warm inside. If she was to brave the freezing temperatures, she needed thicker clothing. She headed toward the hall that branched off to the left. It would lead to the cafeteria and the smaller staff room. She should really avoid that room, but she was hoping to grab a coat from there. On quiet feet, she made her way over, dodging into the shadows every time she heard a noise. After the constant threat of people on the floors above, she wasn't about to relax her guard. As she reached the staff room, Holly hesitated, pressing her ear against the door. She couldn't hear any activity, and she pushed inside. The room was empty, though her eyes kept darting to the shadows. Anyone could be hiding, ready to jump out. She hated the paranoid thoughts, but at least her extreme alertness might keep her safe. Tiptoeing across the room toward a line of lockers, Her eyes took in all the various items people had left lying around. Purses, backpacks, shoes, and coats. More things than she'd owned in her entire adult life. The realization was heart-wrenching, but there was no time to feel sorry for herself. She ran her hands over a coat someone had left lying over a chair. The black material felt soft in her fingers. It looked like it would fit, though it was thinner than she'd like. She pulled it on before glancing at a collection of shoes strewn over the floor. Most would be better than the soft-soled tennis shoes she had on. With another glance about the room, she kicked off her sneakers and pulled on a pair she thought would work. Too big, and she wriggled them off. The next pair was too tight. Tightly knitted brows were a sign her anxiety was kicking up again. This was wasting time she didn't have. She grabbed another pair. A deep sigh as they finally fit. Standing, she spotted a woolen cap and a pair of gloves in an open locker, and she shoved them into her coat pockets. As she was about to leave, her gaze landed on an empty-looking backpack hanging from the coat rack. It seemed to call to her, to reassure her. She rifled through the contents. Inside, 2 cans of Coca-Cola and a car magazine, which she exchanged for her medical file. Then she flung the backpack over her shoulder. This was the first time for as long as she could remember that she was doing something for herself. She was showing initiative and proving that she could take care of herself. Suddenly, the door to the room creaked open. Holly froze, petrified that whoever it was would hear. Her heart hammered so hard in her chest. She shrank into the shadows of the coat rack, letting the clothing cover her thin body, clutching the backpack in her arms. 2 nurses bristled into the room, their eyes skimming right over her hiding spot. She held her breath, trying her utmost not to move. "Crazy," one was saying. "But I guess that's to be expected. Still can't place a call, which is so annoying. Any clues on when they'll get a hold of someone?" "Probably tomorrow, long after we're gone. I'm not surprised the power's been out for so long, though. I've been warning them that Clyde hasn't been doing a proper job of keeping the equipment clean." The first nurse snorted as they reached the lockers, just feet away from where Holly stood. Should either of them shift their gazes to the left, they would look straight into her eyes. Yet both were too distracted as they continued to share theories over whether Clyde should get fired for the backup generators failing to come on. Terrified to move so much as a finger or let out too loud of a breath, Holly watched them from her spot. "Harriet is having a fit about the night crew not all showing up," the first nurse said. "It's going to be a long night. I swear these numbskulls can sense our weaknesses and exploit them." The second nurse muttered her agreement as they turned and marched out. Holly waited. When she was certain the coast was clear, she stepped from her hiding place and left the staff room, moving in the opposite direction the nurses had headed. Ahead, she spotted the worn chairs outside the pharmacy. They were usually occupied with patients muttering to themselves as they waited for their medication. Now, they sat empty. With a glance over her shoulder, she pushed open the door, stopping short as she spotted a familiar figure with his back to her. Ducking behind a line of chairs in front of the counter, she pressed a hand to her mouth to catch the gasp of surprise that threatened to give her away. Nurse Julian. With trembling knees, Holly stayed crouched, her heart fluttering as she pressed herself further into the shadows. He hadn't seen her. Yet. If he did, he'd drag her straight back to her room by the scruff of her neck and squeal to Dr. Burke about her wanderings. And she could kiss any freedom goodbye. Nurse Julian was digging around on a shelf, tossing bottles about and cussing. An odor of tobacco smoke reached her nose as she peered over the chair at him. A lit cigarette hung from his lips while he stood, arms on hips, frowning at the shelves. The familiar smell pulled at Holly, dragging her back to earlier in the morning. Vague memories of him at her side, and the waft of his cigarettes as he jabbed a needle in her arm, his touch rough, his eyes not even on her arm as he went about prepping her. Preparing her for what, though? Her hand moved to her head as she tried to remember, but that's all she had. Nurse Julian getting her ready, barely registering her existence, and not a word spoken between them. His cold eyes held nothing other than irritation when he'd looked at her. She'd seen the same expression with his other patients. Heavy footsteps pulled her back to the present. She watched as he stormed past her with several vials in his hands, no doubt off to sedate some poor, distressed patient. A chill worked down her spine at the thought. The cigarette smoke lingered even as his steps faded, making her feel uneasy, like he'd left some part of him behind to watch over her. Cautiously, she stood and stepped toward the counter. Staring at the mess left behind by Nurse Julian, she didn't know where to start. The pharmacist would have a fit. A part of her had expected to find everything neatly organized, with rows of labeled bottles, many with patients' names. That would have made it that much easier to find what she needed. But standing there, she realized how wrong she'd been. Other than the boxes and bottles that he'd scattered about the floor, more tablets sat in bottles of various sizes on the shelves. She moved through them, her lips moving as she read the labels, trying to spot familiar names. She'd memorized the pills that helped, pestering the nurses to tell her what they were. Eventually, some did with a reluctant shrug, and she would repeat the words to herself, syllable by syllable, until the names lodged in her brain. Lexapro, Prozac, Restoril, Vyvanse, Ambien. She would take any of them, anything she came across that sounded familiar. As she searched through the shelves, she paused frequently to glance nervously at the door. Nurse Julian or anyone else could come in at any moment. Finally, she grabbed several handfuls of bottles with familiar-sounding names, and she shoved them into her backpack, not forgetting to pick up a bunch of boxes of painkillers. It would have to be enough. She was relieved to leave the pharmacy behind. Being caught there wouldn't look good. But she couldn't afford to let her guard down. Thoughts of constant surveillance put speed in her steps as she put more distance between herself and the pharmacy. Turning a corner, she stepped into the open dining hall, relief sagging her shoulders. The room sat silent. Pale moonlight filtered in from the large windows across the room, casting enough light for her to see the rows of neatly organized tables and chairs. It was like an obstacle course navigating the crowded room. Yet her eyes remained fixed on the double doors that led to the kitchen. Holly moved swiftly through, taking in the stainless steel appliances and sparkling counters. The order of it reassured her she would find what she needed. Her shoes squeaked on the floor as she moved toward the pantry, though she didn't mind. Here, she knew she was alone. The cooks and servers would have gone home hours ago, and none of the nurses or orderlies would want to fetch anything from here. She smiled as she opened a cupboard filled with small packets of mixed nuts and individually wrapped cookies. Usually a treat, something she rarely earned. She reached for one, unwrapping the chocolate chip cookie and stuffing it into her mouth. Chewing noisily, she shoved as many of the packets of nuts and cookies as she could into the bag. All she needed now was water. The feeling of success, and of having accomplished more of her plan than she'd thought, hit her as she went in search of water. She knew they stored cases of mineral water somewhere here, She'd seen visitors walking around with the large bottles that had the hospital's name printed in bold letters, as though they were a souvenir. Opening a low cabinet, she bent to examine it. That's when she heard a whine. She turned to find a tiny dog staring at her from across the room. Holly went still as the animal bared its teeth, its whine cranking up into a bark. Without warning, it shot toward her, intent on tearing her to shreds.
Patrick stepped from the store to find that darkness had fallen. He frowned into the night as snow swirled around him. People flapped about in the parking lot, their voices more frantic than earlier. Panic was setting in. "Damn thing won't start," one man grumbled loudly as he stomped past. Another man shouted, "Anyone got any jump cables?" Without the rumbling of cars that usually filled the air, the night was strangely quiet. Even the voices did little to fill the silent void. To make it feel normal, Pat thought as he trudged back to his truck. There it sat, coated in white, pristine snow. Eyebrows pinched, cell phone in hand, he checked around the vehicle in the meager light the cell offered. At least there weren't any fresh footprints anywhere nearby. How long would it be before people lost their good sense and turned to more desperate measures? Tap, 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 tap. Unlocking his car, he set down his bag of groceries before digging around for the ice scraper he knew was in there somewhere. It took him a moment to find it buried in the back seat. With swift movements, he set about brushing off the snow. He was thankful that, though the temperature had dropped dramatically in the last hour, the ice was only just forming. "Do you think I could borrow that?" Pat looked over his shoulder at the younger woman standing there. She looked uncertain as her eyes flitted between him and a black Chevy Chevelle. He couldn't stop the low whistle that escaped him. The vintage vehicle looked to be in immaculate condition. The woman laughed at his reaction. "It was my dad's. He passed a few months ago," she explained. "I was on my way back to Portland from California when I stopped for gas and snacks. Seems I should have just pushed through. It'll be even longer of a drive with this mayhem." "I'm sorry about your dad." She shrugged, her eyes going misty. "Keep it," Pat told her as he handed over the ice scraper. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "I've got another floating around, and a car like that deserves to be snow-free so everyone can enjoy it." "Thank you." The woman smiled. A tear tracked down her cheek as she looked up at Pat. He couldn't help but see a little of his daughter in her. Would there be a day when he was gone and Piper was driving his old truck around? He glanced at it and almost laughed. That old heap of junk wouldn't make it another 5 years, and besides, he couldn't imagine her wanting anything to do with it. Still, he liked the thought. "Good luck," Pat said. "Be safe out there. The roads will be a mess." "Thanks again." She trudged back to her car, and he watched for a moment as she set about clearing the snow before he climbed into his truck. Doing his best to shake away the pull of wistful thoughts, he slid the key into the ignition. The engine turned over once, making a strangled noise, followed by silence. After a few seconds, he tried the ignition again, but this time, nothing. His eyes narrowed as he smudged the dashboard, the squeaking noise grating his ears. Had the old thing finally given up? It wouldn't surprise him. He leaned back in his seat, avoiding the powerful urge to drum his finger on the steering wheel, and closed his eyes. Let's give her another chance, though he mentally prepared himself for the walk several blocks to the house. One more turn of the ignition, and the truck sputtered to life. Everything sounded a little rough, but that wasn't anything new. He'd have to check under the hood when he got to the house, or tomorrow when it became light. Pulling away from his spot, he noticed the attention his rumbling truck got. A young couple were heaving their SUV toward the exit. Pat wound the window down, turning to face them. "Need a hand?"
"Thank you, sir. We're fine,"
the man puffed.
"We only live a couple of
blocks away. If we can't get this thing started, we'll leave it here till the morning." Rolling out the parking lot, he peered out along the dark street. No surprise the power was still out. With the storm worsening, he imagined it would be a day or more until crews were dispatched to get things back up and running again. People were going to be full of complaints about that. Tap, 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 tap. He hated that he couldn't figure out what was happening, that his mind immediately jumped to worst-case scenarios, something he knew his therapist would want to dive into. Too many thoughts of terrorists and bombs were spinning in his head. There would be several logical reasons that would explain why the power was out and cars in the parking lot weren't moving, and why smashed and stalled cars littered the road as he turned onto it. Bound to be, though he couldn't think of them just yet. He squirmed as he narrowly avoided hitting a stalled-out minivan, swerving at the last moment. Without the streetlights to light the way, and with the snow descending in heavy sheets, he struggled to see out the windshield. The headlights on his truck were at least a decade old, long past when he should have swapped the bulbs for new ones, and dimmer than he'd like. Though night driving wasn't something he had any reason to do anymore. He hadn't in years, not since he retired from the force. Anyway, there was rarely any reason for him to leave the house at night anymore. One less reminder of what had happened. Another thing he failed at, if you ask Jane. Tap, 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 tap. Memories of that night flooded his head. It may have happened a few years back, but his body still always tensed at every stopped car. Every white sedan that pulled out was the suspect's, and his grip would tighten on the steering wheel. He sighed as he maneuvered around the cars, keeping to a slow pace, his foot hovering over the brake. Between roving pedestrians and cars positioned every which way, it took him 20 minutes to make it a block. He considered cutting through the residential streets, but then he'd have to go around the state hospital grounds. This would add unnecessary time to an already perilous journey. No. He'd manage. At least it was a sign that he was making the right decision by stopping off at Salem. By now, the highway out of town would be clogged with the rush-hour traffic, and goodness knows how many more stalled vehicles. It would be a nightmare to navigate. Best he waited till rush hour was over, at least. Combined with the snow and darkness, he would rather brave the roads tomorrow. Either the storm would pass, or the state would have the plows out, working to clear the ice and snow and make the roads more drivable. But it would be a long night for the force. Out there, ensuring people were safe. They'd be running all over the place, responding to frantic calls. Most would be people doing dumb things like driving when they shouldn't be or going too fast when the roads turned to ice. He'd seen it all during his time on the force. He was used to nights like these, where it felt like the sky was a constant blend of gray and red and blue, where morning couldn't come fast enough, and he lived on a prayer that the next day would be better. Preoccupied with thoughts of the past, he wasn't paying enough attention to the crowd that was gathered around a vehicle. He slammed his brakes and skidded to a halt, a curse on his lips as he stared out the windshield. Several people were peering in through the windows, shouting at whoever was inside. A few turned to watch his approach, panic and fear clear on their faces. He noted the newish blue sedan that seemed to have jumped the curb and collided with the light pole next to the intersection. The metal pole was leaning heavily toward the other side of the junction, where onlookers had stepped from their cars to examine the damage, adding to the crowd in the streets. Somebody might be injured or trapped inside. He couldn't just drive away. Tap, 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 tap. Muttering about the wretched snow and terrible drivers, Pat put the truck in park and grabbed the keys. He could only assume this was yet another accident, though cars had been pushed against one another around him and it wasn't so easy to see. "What's going on?" he asked as he approached the crowd. A woman glanced at him, her eyes wide, before pointing toward the vehicle wrapped around the pole. The driver must have lost control as it had skidded off the road. Another unfortunate accident that was lacking any emergency response. Then his eyes caught on a tiny face in the window. A child, bright red cheeks, tears streaming down his face as he stared out at the crowd. Pat moved before he even realized it, his paternal instincts kicking in. A young guy was furiously pulling at one of the passenger doors, while two women were talking to the boy through the window, trying to calm him. "We need to get him out," Pat said, his eyes already checking for leaking gas or oil that would add to the urgency. Thankfully, he saw none. "We can't," the guy grunted over his shoulder. "The doors are stuck. We need to break a window." Pat glanced around, his eyes stopping at the front of the vehicle. A man and a woman lay slumped in their seats. They looked to be in their mid-60s. The woman in the passenger seat had blood dripping from a large gash in her forehead. Next to her, the man's head rested on the steering wheel. It was as if he was asleep, but his eyes were wide open and his neck at an unnatural angle. They were both dead. The boy, their grandson perhaps, was stuck in the back. "I have something in my truck," Pat said, turning to walk back to his truck. One woman shot him a look. "I know you." Tap, 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 tap. The 3 words were enough to pause Pat as he met her gaze. His time in the force had seen him interact with countless faces, most of which he'd forgotten. Not to mention his stint in the hospital after the shooting, which had garnered him his fair share of media attention. "I was Piper's 5th-grade teacher." Pat nodded, still trying to place her name. That was right after Kimberly divorced him, when he'd still been fighting for a fairer deal that didn't see her getting full custody of his kids. He vaguely remembered the few parent-teacher conferences he'd navigated on his own, and smiling at the kind words the teachers had offered about his children. "Are you still with Salem PD?" the woman asked. He shook his head. "Early retirement, but I guess once a cop." "Of all the people, I'm glad to see you here, Mr. Dunn," the woman said before she turned to her friend. "He was in the force for years, good man. He'll get this boy out." Pat went back to his truck before he could hear more of what the woman had to say about him. He wished he could remember her name, but he kept drawing a blank. It took him a moment to rummage through the back seat before he found the old rusty tire iron he'd been meaning to throw out. "This should work," he said, returning to the crumbled car. The woman, who he vaguely recalled, her surname was something with an H, Howard or Harrison or something, nodded at him. Her eyes danced between the rusty metal in his hands and the distraught boy trapped in the car. "Scoot back, honey," the other woman encouraged the boy. "We're going to get you out." The boy didn't move for a moment, gazing at the scene outside the car with wide eyes. But after a few seconds, he did, shifting as far away from the window as he could, pressing himself against the opposite door and curling himself into a ball. Pat approached, forcing his face to look casual as he lifted the tire iron. This could end badly. Glass could cut the boy, or worse, but they had to do something. Without letting himself overthink, he swung the iron. The boy shot his hands to his ears and squirmed. The first hit wasn't successful. Just a small crack formed. "You're okay, buddy, but I need to give it another go," Pat shouted to the boy. "Keep tight, you'll be fine." He hit it again. And again. Finally, the glass gave, shattering to the ground. "I need something to clear this off." Pat pointed to the window, turning to the gathered crowd. "Here," someone said, handing him a wool-lined jacket. Wrapping his hands in the thick material, Pat set to work clearing out the glass pieces before laying it over the bottom of the window and looking at the boy. "You'll have to climb over, bud," he told him. "Think you can do that?" The boy nodded, but stayed frozen. "My name's Pat. What's yours?"
"Devin."
"Okay, Devin, I'm here to help you. We need to get you out, okay?"
"'Kay."
Pat smiled. "Do you live around here, Devin?" Devin nodded before pointing vaguely toward the surrounding houses. Pat did his best not to let his smile slip. So close to home for an accident like this to happen, for this young boy to be robbed of his grandparents. "All right, well, we'd better get you home then," Pat said. "Your mom and dad will be happy to see you, I bet." Devin nodded again, and slowly he inched forward. Pat helped him maneuver over the glass littering the back seat before pulling him from the car. A small cheer went up as Pat set him down on the icy ground. "Here you go," the woman said, stepping forward to wrap Devin in a fleece blanket. He lives around here, Pat said. We should get him home and let his parents know what's happened. The woman glanced at the boy for a moment before she said, You seem to have the only running vehicle, so you should take him. I'll come with if you like. Thank you, ma'am, Pat said. She glanced at him before nodding. It's Mrs. Harrison, for the record. I'm terrible at names. I would have been surprised if you had remembered. Now let's get this poor lamb out of the cold.
Holly. Frozen to the spot, Holly watched as the ferocious animal stopped right in front of her with its teeth bared. Low growls filled the room as it stared up at her with its black bullet eyes. Terrified that he'd take a chunk out of her if she moved, slowly she held her hands out in surrender. For what seemed like an age, Holly stood there, unable to move as the dog continued to growl. She'd never had a dog, so she hadn't the first idea how to handle the situation. Her mind presented her with various scenarios, each ending with her getting bitten. Though, after a moment, she suspected the dog was maybe more scared of her than she was of him. She was towering over it, after all. She could understand the poor creature's fear. Slowly, she bent to a crouch. It snarled, but didn't move. Poor thing, you must be frightened, she whispered. I am too, if you want to know the truth. How did a little thing like you end up in a place like this? The dog perked an ear. She could see the same question in the dog's eyes, wondering how she'd ended up here. Giving the dog a soft smile, her gaze moved about the kitchen. She needed something to offer him to win him over. Opening the cabinet behind her, she spotted a couple packets of rice cakes. She didn't know what dogs ate, but they'd have to do. Grabbing them, she eased into a crouch. Each movement earned her a low growl, sending the hairs on her arms to stand to attention. But surely, if he'd meant to bite her, he would have done so by now. You look half-starved, she soothed, pulling out one of the rice cakes. She tossed it a few feet away from her. The dog stared at it, his wariness clear from the way his ears tucked back, his small tail going between his legs. She frowned as she stared at him. He looked just as terrified as she felt. Worse. And he looked half-starved, his ribs poked through his fur. Angry sores were clear where patches of fur had fallen away. I won't hurt you. As though trusting her word, the dog crept forward, taking the offering in one swift bite. Almost like he expected her to snatch the food back from him. She took out another 2 biscuits. Bit by bit, the dog crept closer, until finally it was within reach. Slowly and gently, she reached out her hand. He sniffed, a low growl coming from him as she patted his head, smiling. You're better off leaving him, a voice said. Startled, she looked up. Nurse Julian stood watching her, his arms crossed over his chest. She hadn't heard the door open or his approaching footsteps. Too absorbed in winning over the dog. Fear, hot and unwelcome, flooded her gut at the realization he'd caught her. He hates people, women especially. Her tongue was suddenly too dry to speak. You shouldn't be out of your room. He bent to grab her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh as he heaved her to her feet. Ouch, that hurts. Let me go, she said. Please. The dog's growls turned into high-pitched yaps, pulling her attention back to it. Its beady eyes were on Nurse Julian, but the gleam in the nurse's eye had her stomach dropping. She'd seen that look before, all those years ago. She was not about to live through that again. Sheer panic, with anger mixed in, roiled through her as her free hand scrabbled along the counter. searching for something, anything. Her fingers grabbed onto a mixer. It wasn't the ideal weapon, but it was better than nothing. The nurse barely noticed as he loomed over her. With her left hand, she brought it up and crashed it on his head. The sound of metal against his skull rang out, and with a loud curse, he crumpled to the ground at her feet. Horror filled her as she stared down at him. She couldn't believe she'd just done that. Her heart was hammering faster than ever. Nurse Julian let out a low moan as he tried to pull himself up, but his arm gave way, and he fell back again. He tried again, grunting with the exertion. She hadn't knocked him out. In a moment, he'd be up and angry. Her blood ran cold as she watched him struggling to get to his feet. She needed to think quickly. If she wanted to escape, she needed to do it now. Adrenaline-fueled, Holly grabbed the dog and sped out of the kitchen. Behind her, she could hear Nurse Julian's loud curses. As she careened down the hall, she clutched the growling dog tighter in her arms, pushing herself to run faster and faster, though it felt like she was moving too slowly as she approached the front doors. Down the hallway, Nurse Julian was yelling, alerting others to her escape. But she didn't stop. Determination spurred her on, and she flung the doors open. Cold slapped her in the face, but she pushed through it, racing down the steps and across the snow-covered drive to the parking lot. Outside, it was freezing and pitch dark. That didn't matter right now. She'd rather face the cold outdoors and the unknown of the world that lay beyond the hospital's boundaries, to the punishment that awaited her in the hospital. She ducked behind a parked SUV, gently setting the dog down. Its tiny body trembled. Suddenly, all of its bite from earlier had gone. She stared down at it, at a loss for what to do next. She was free from the hospital, but this was just the start of her journey. "You're free now," Holly told the dog. He let out a whimper in response while she patted its head. Suddenly, a curse splintered the quiet of the night, followed by the loud roar of a motorcycle. Crouched behind the rear wheel of the vehicle, Holly watched as a blur of black raced past her. Her breath snagged in her throat as she realized just how close she'd come to getting caught. But he was gone. The dog let out a low whine and sidled into the nook of her arm. Sympathy filled her at the way the wretched animal was shaking like a leaf in the bitter cold. He was no better suited for this sudden freedom than she was. Whilst she knew she was unprepared to be caring for herself, much less another creature, she couldn't leave the poor thing on its own. "I guess we're stuck with one another," she whispered. The dog gave a slow blink, as though considering this. Then, with a whimper, it pressed further against her, as though signaling its agreement. Despite herself, she smiled at the animal as she got to her feet. The cold was already biting, but she had supplies and newfound freedom. This was the start of something great. "We'd best be getting as far away from here as possible," she told the dog. Together, they slipped out from behind the SUV and trudged their way through the parking lot and into the dark night beyond.
Patrick. It took all of a moment for Pat to realize he had no idea where to deliver this child. Mrs. Harrison chewed her lip as she studied the boy's face. He couldn't have been older than 5 or 6. His eyes were wide and alert, taking in the 2 adults watching him. "Do you know where you live, sweetie?" Mrs. Harrison asked. Devin nodded slowly, his lips quivering. "Down the street from Grammy and Pop's house. I get to walk there by myself sometimes." Then he added, his voice all too quiet, "They picked me up from Marty's house." Pat glanced back at the car with the dead bodies, then back to Devin. "Are they your Grammy and Pop?" he asked. Devin nodded again. For once, luck was on his side. There was bound to be something in the vehicle with their details. Pat shot Mrs. Harrison a look he hoped conveyed that she was to stay in the truck with the boy, and he hopped out into the bitter night. Curious eyes watched him as he picked his way back toward the car. It was a lucky break that the grandparents lived so close to the kid's place. Otherwise, he wasn't sure what to do with him. Drop him at the closest police station and hope someone there could track down his parents. Tap, 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 tap. Again, he pulled his phone from his pocket. Nothing. No bars, no signal. He frowned at the blackened screen. Cell phones. He hated them. Hated how it was so easy for anyone and everybody to contact him, yet just as easy for his kids to use the same thing to ignore him. But most of all, he resented how the entire world was so reliant on them, including him. He shook his head. He could have used it now. It would have been a relief to know he could reach out to his kids and to check they were okay. Tap, 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 tap. Turning his attention back to the vehicle in front of him, he took a deep breath. It felt wrong that so many people were wandering around, ogling the two corpses in the front seats. There should be flashing lights and officials there to divert attention, to at least offer some peace and dignity to them in death. Instead, their bodies were left out in the open. It was unsettling. He did his best to climb in the car. With his stiff leg, it wasn't the easiest maneuvering, but eventually he got in. Reaching past the deceased grandmother, he opened the glove box. A sigh escaped him at the sight of the bundle of papers wedged inside, as though they were waiting for him. Moving quickly, he grabbed them all, stuffed them in his jacket pocket, then began his ungraceful exit out of the car. He was all too aware of the onlookers and the inquisitive stares. He expected somebody to say something, but most had already turned their attention back to their own stalled cars, losing interest all too quickly. The cab of his truck was quiet as he climbed back in. He handed the bundle over to Mrs. Harrison, who eagerly tore into it and rifled through the paperwork. It was only seconds before she plucked out an envelope and shook her head. "Just a few blocks from here," she said. "What a shame, so close to home." Pat shone his phone in her direction. The beam from the flashlight was enough for him to read out the address. He was familiar with these streets and relieved that he wouldn't be driving too far out of his way. The more of the mess he saw, the more eager he was to be far away from it all. "Buckle up and let's hit the road," Mrs. Harrison said, the fake enthusiasm in her voice grating on Pat. "Not much longer, honey. We're taking you home." She gave the boy a reassuring smile. Pat clicked his seatbelt and shifted into drive. The ride to the boy's house was wordless, with Pat's focus fully on the road, while Mrs. Harrison gazed out the window. Every so often, she would flick her head around to check on the boy. Pulling outside a row of single-story brick houses, Pat stared out the windshield for a moment before he cut the engine and looked back at Devin. "Which is your house, buddy?" he asked. Devin pointed across the street. Mrs. Harrison slipped from the car, opened the back door, and took the boy in her arms. Pat was suddenly thankful for her presence. Showing up together to break the news seemed better than him being there alone with the boy. Though, as he turned to stare at the dark road, he frowned. He thought he'd left his days of breaking the worst kind of news to family members behind. Too many early mornings had seen him haunting strangers' doorsteps with bad news. Tap, 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 tap. "Ready?" Mrs. Harrison shot him a sideways look as she marched past him to the front door. Pat nodded, hunched his shoulders, stepping behind her. The snow crunched beneath his boots. He couldn't feel his toes, it was so cold. They hesitated for a moment before Mrs. Harrison tried the doorbell. Then, when the house remained silent, she raised her fist to the door. The boy wriggled in her arms. "It's okay, honey, we won't leave you," she said. "We'll find Mommy and Daddy." A nervous minute passed before Pat could hear voices. Relief hit him that someone was home. It wouldn't be much longer before he could wash his hands of all this and continue his journey. "Hello?" a woman asked, blinking at them before she recognized her son in the stranger's arms. "Devin, what's happened?" Pat and Mrs. Harrison exchanged a look. Mrs. Harrison shuffled uncomfortably while Pat cleared his throat and stepped forward. "I regret to inform you that there's been an accident, ma'am," Pat said. The woman's eyes widened for a moment before understanding dawned. "Oh," the woman said. She reached for Devin, who easily fell into her arms and buried his head in her chest. "Oh, no. Oh, my husband. I need to get him." "I'm terribly sorry," Mrs. Harrison told her. A large man appeared in the doorway, frowning as he took in his crying wife and son before he eyed the two strangers. "What's going on?" he asked. "Mike, it's your parents. There's been an accident." "Are they at the hospital?" Mike said. "Why isn't Devin with them?" "I'm so sorry. I'm afraid a hospital won't do them any good," Mrs. Harrison said with a grimace. Mike shook his head, glancing past them into the dark night. Pat had seen this scene play out a dozen times and more. This man struck him as the type that would be in denial for as long as he could. "They're dead?" Mike asked. His eyes met Pat's. Softening his face, Pat nodded. "Just a few blocks over. Looks like your dad may have suffered a heart attack that led to the crash." "The good news is your son is fine. Walked away without a scratch," Mrs. Harrison added. "Why aren't the police here informing us?" Mike asked. "No signals getting through," Pat replied. "My bet is that they have everyone they can out dealing with things. It's not the only accident I passed this afternoon coming from West Salem. I imagine they've got their hands full, especially with the snow and ice." The wife sobbed as Mike absent-mindedly reached out to place a comforting hand on her shoulder. His eyes glazed over as he processed the information that his parents were dead. "I need to see," he finally said. "It's wrong to leave them there." "The car won't start, hon," his wife said, wiping at the tears on her cheeks. "I just tried it, not long ago when your parents still weren't back with Devin. I was getting worried when none of my calls were going through." "My truck's running," Pat offered, surprising himself. "I can help." "Hon," his wife warned. He looked at her, hurt in his gaze as he said, "I can't just leave them there, Sharon. I need to do something." Mrs. Harrison watched the scene unfolding for a moment before she moved toward Sharon, offering her a hug before gently ushering her and Devin into the house. Pat and Mike spoke little as Pat drove. The snow was falling heavier than before, and visibility was getting worse, which meant Pat needed to focus on the road ahead and block out any distractions as they crawled along. Silence filled the cab, though Pat sensed Mike wanted to say something. "This soundage is weird," Mike finally said. "The storm just started, so it can't be that. And cars and cells not working? It's different, that's for sure. Doesn't feel right." Pat frowned. "I don't know, it just seems like something major has knocked out the power," Mike said. "It's like some gigantic explosion or electromagnetic pulse has hit the state, possibly the whole of the U.S. An EMP. You know about these things?" "I'm an electrician. We need to know about electromagnetic interference and how it affects electrical circuits. Though I've seen nothing like this before," he trailed off. "But I'm an avid sci-fi reader, so I guess it could be my overactive imagination. But you still reckon it's an EMP?" Mike shrugged, as though he didn't fully buy the argument. But Pat couldn't shake the thought. It would explain the dead cars and why his cell still had no bars. It would explain a lot of the weirdness. But an EMP? That just didn't happen. Unless... Tap, 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 tap. Reaching the intersection, Pat was relieved to push thoughts of EMPs from his mind. He expected that nothing would have changed, and he wasn't wrong. The same people from half an hour ago were wandering about, looking just as confused as before. He stopped the truck, glancing at the agitated man sitting in the passenger seat. With a grim look, he gave Pat a nod. "I didn't want to believe it," Mike said, staring at the wreckage of his parents' car across the intersection. What was there to say about losing one's parents? Pat had lost both his a decade ago, and it was a loss he still felt. A reminder of the support system he had lost when they'd passed, just a year apart. Mike stayed in the car for a moment before numbly opening the door and stepping into the night. Giving him a moment, Pat was slow to follow. As he stepped from the truck, the frigid air burned his nostrils, raising goosebumps down his arms. He tightened his parka jacket, wrapping his scarf over the tip of his nose. Mike was walking toward the car in a daze, people shooting him glances. It took little to put two and two together, and most of them wore somber looks as they turned their backs, allowing him a moment to gather himself as he grieved. Wordlessly, Mike dropped to his knees just next to the passenger side of the car. His sobs broke the muted quiet of the night. Pat turned away, unable to watch this stranger's heartbreak, waiting until the sobs quieted. They deserve better than to be left here. Mike shook his head as he tapped his phone. I guess it's no surprise my cell still ain't working. I'm not even sure an ambulance could get here, or any emergency vehicles. Not for a while, with things being as they are, said Pat. That's what I feared, Mike admitted, standing, turning to meet Pat's eyes. I can't leave them here. Not when anything could happen. And for all I know, it could be days before someone can get them to the morgue. If the morgue is even open with the power out. This seemed to decide something for Mike. His face tensed as he glanced once more at his parents. Sharon won't like it, but I can't leave them out here. He choked on a sob, then rubbed his eyes with both his hands. These are the people that raised me. If worse comes to worse, he said through gritted teeth. I have a shovel. I'll figure something out. Are you sure? Pat asked. I am. I can't just leave them. They deserve better. Even the knowledge that their bodies aren't left lying here in the middle of the intersection is enough. Can you help me? Pat nodded, placing a hand on Mike's arm. Together, they took in the scene before them. It was a surreal moment, standing there, staring at the wreckage, knowing that they were about to transport this man's dead parents to his house. Pat yanked open the driver's door, while Mike took a hold of his father's corpse. Excuse me, sir, we'd like to help, a woman said, appearing next to them. We have blankets you can use to... Thank you, Mike said. That was all it took for everyone to come together. Strangers working to get the bodies out of the car. Hardly a word passing between them, but there was comfort in their presence. Wrapped in wool blankets, they placed the bodies gently into the back of Pat's truck. They shared hugs and tears as Mike and Pat climbed back into his truck 30 minutes later. Again, Mike spoke little as Pat drove, though there was less tension this time. Sharon won't want the bodies in the house, Mike said as Pat pulled up to the curb. But it seems wrong to leave them in the garage. The cold will help, Pat said. Best place for them. Mike looked like he wanted to argue this, but after a moment, he nodded. Together, they carried each body into the garage, placing them carefully onto the blankets they draped over the concrete floor. Before Pat could make his excuses, he found himself invited in. The least I can do for you is offer you a drink, Mike said. Pat couldn't muster the energy or excuses to say no, so he let Mike lead him into the house. Sharon and Mrs. Harrison were in the kitchen, with Devin clinging to his mother's side as they entered. It's true? Sharon asked. Mike nodded, and tears fell from his cheeks. I pulled out the good whiskey. I figured your dad would approve. Patrick. It took Patrick some time to extract himself from the grieving family. Mrs. Harrison left right after accepting a single drink in memory of Mike's deceased parents. Eager to return to her car, she insisted she didn't mind the walk of a few blocks. Pat had stayed, comforted by the family scene and the relief of reuniting Mom and Dad with their young son. Tears and smiles mixed as the family watched Pat trudge to his car. He raised his hand once in a last farewell, a brief smile pulling at his lips as the young Devon peered out from behind his parents' legs. Pat felt the paternal pull to get back to his kids, but again, he ignored it. They were older now and wouldn't welcome him invading their privacy as they awaited their mom's return. But he'd stop by and check in on them before heading to the cabin in the morning. He paused for a moment once he'd climbed into his truck. Full darkness had set in, and the falling snow made the sky a strange dark gray, promising more snow to come. It would be even more of a mess come tomorrow, especially if the power was still down. Leaving the house behind, it suddenly hit him. The quiet of the night. There were no sirens blaring, no red and blue lights to cut through the darkness, assuring the people that help was on the way. Just darkness and silence stretching through the streets, unlike anything he was used to in the city. It troubled him more than he ever could have expected. Tap, 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 tap. Pat frowned out his windshield, swerving to avoid a stooped figure hobbling down the street. The man lifted his head and waved as Pat drove by. He shouldn't be out in these conditions, and Pat was about to stop to check if he needed a lift before he saw the man head down a path to one of the houses. Hopefully, that was his home. With a sigh, Pat turned off the main road. The state hospital was ahead, and though he hadn't planned to take this route, he figured it would be easier to cut through their roads. They would at least have had the plows out so the staff could come and go, and there wouldn't be as many vehicles or pedestrians there. Old rumors and superstitions were more than effective at keeping trespassers away. Though he'd once responded to a call for a group of high school kids that had thought it funny to throw eggs at the old red brick building. But that was just the once. Pat was relieved he wouldn't have another maze to navigate through. His nerves were so frayed he was suddenly ready to be at the house, even though he'd have to deal with Jane, who'd be panicking by now. But that would still be easier than the weather, and everything else he'd had to deal with that day. Tap, 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 tap. By this point, he was squinting out the window, looking out for the turnoff. There were fewer cars on this section of the road, and nobody wandering about. Everyone must be in their homes by now, including that old guy. The moment he turned off the street, the houses disappeared, and the expansive, snow-covered grounds of the hospital stretched out before him. Snow fell heavier now, nearly blinding him as he lifted his foot off the accelerator. His mind wandered to the tasks he needed to accomplish at the house. He wanted to get as much done as possible so he wouldn't have to go back there again. Clenching the steering wheel, he realized there was no way he'd be able to make it to his cabin tonight, which meant spending an uncomfortable night on the couch in front of a dead TV. Jane would be pissed, but she'd just have to put up with it. Anyhow, he'd leave first thing and well before she woke up. Then he could disappear into the wilderness up at Detroit Lake. The snow would have kept the tourists away, and he might even get in some hunting. That thought brought a smile to his lips. It was so dark, he almost missed the woman struggling in the snow along the side of the road. But he caught her out of the corner of his eye as he crept along. She was wearing a thin winter coat, and he spied a small dog in her arms. He shook his head when he saw the way she favored one leg, giving her a marked limp that slowed her progress. It was freezing out, and she wasn't dressed to be tramping in the snow. She'd be half frozen. She must be. It wouldn't take long for the cold to claim her, to leave her shivering and confused. And if she remained out in the icy temperatures, hypothermia would get her. Tap, 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 tap. To be out on that road, she had to be a nurse or an ancillary worker from the hospital. But what was she doing walking by herself at night? And with a dog? Groaning, he slammed the brakes and skidded to a stop. He watched her in the rearview mirror. Her entire body was shaking from chills as she approached him, and there was a wariness in her eyes. Leaning over the passenger seat, he rolled down the window, doing his best to offer a kindly smile. She backed away from the vehicle, her gaze cautious as she met his eyes. Need a lift, ma'am? Her eyes widened, and he couldn't help but feel as though she looked at him like he was a serial killer. Hell, in her eyes, he was no better than one. But he couldn't just leave some woman walking through the dark, blustery night on her own without at least checking in. Not a single part of him would allow that.
Holly. Holly shrank away from the man in the truck. He had a kind face, but looks could deceive, and she knew better than to trust that. The engine rattled loudly, breaking the silence of the night. In her arms, the dog was shivering as violently as she was. She'd not been prepared for just how cold it was, nor how the snow would slip into her shoes when she'd stomped across the grounds to get to the side road. It seemed like it had only been 5 minutes since she'd left the hospital behind, and already the outside world overwhelmed her. It was wide and open, and threats lay everywhere, just waiting to pounce. She could almost feel that awful nurse following her, his hot breath on her neck. Too many years spent locked inside the hospital had left her ill-prepared for this. Her eyes took in the man's vehicle, the rust marks and the puff of white exhaust that drifted from the tailpipe. She didn't trust him, and she didn't want to accept the ride, but it looked like she didn't have any choice. Otherwise, she'd freeze to death out here. The dog, too. "Need a lift, ma'am?" he repeated. "You look cold. You'll catch your death if you stay out here much longer." The man didn't sound like a serial killer. He didn't have any snarl to his lips or flash of anything evil to his eyes. In fact, he had a nice, gentle voice, almost melodic. Besides, the little dog was watching the man, and there wasn't even a whine coming from him. Surely the dog would sense a threat. He did with the nurse. She needed to calm herself. Sat there, in this beat-up truck, he reminded her of her dad. Years back, before his accident, he'd had something similar. "Look, I won't hurt you, I promise," he said. He pointed to the dog. "What's he called?" The question threw her. "Butler." It was the first name that came to her head, though it seemed like a nice name for a dog. "Hey, Butler, you're a cute pooch," he said. "Why don't you and Butler get in the truck, and I'll take you where you need to be?" She hesitated for several moments, hugging the dog tight to her chest. He didn't seem to mind, though he let out a little whimper. She had no choice but to trust this guy. "If you don't mind, yes. Thank you, sir." "Hop in," the man said. The man watched her as she reached for the door, pulling it open to a loud squeal that left him flinching. Ungracefully, she pulled herself into the passenger seat, her grip on the dog tightening before she pulled the door closed. Success. She'd trapped herself in the truck, alone with a strange man. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run. "Patrick, but you can call me Pat," the man said, offering his hand. Slowly, she slipped her hand into his, noting his firm grip and calloused fingers. "Holly." "Nice to meet you, Holly," he said, offering her a small smile. "Where to?" Panic clawed at her. What should I tell him? I need to get to Meadowview." The moment the words came out of her mouth, she wished she could take them back. That was at least a 2-hour drive away, if not more, thanks to the snow. He wouldn't be willing to drive her all the way there. Not that she expected him to. But her mind had pulled a blank on where in Salem to ask him to drop her off. "My mom," Holly added, flinching. Taking a deep breath, she tried again. "My mom called to tell me she was sick. When my shift ended, I found my car was dead. I just need to get to her, so I thought I'd walk to the bus station. I can deal with the car another time, but I need to get to her tonight to make sure she's okay." Avoiding his eyes, she distracted herself with the dog, though she felt the man's gaze on her, as if he was deciding whether to believe her. Her chest constricted, and she tried to calm her breathing, hoping against hope that he would buy into her lie. After a pause, the man said, "I can take you to the station. It's only a few blocks away." "Thanks. But I warn you, there's been quite a few disturbances on the road and a major power out, so I'm not sure if the buses are running." "That's okay. I understand. I'll wait till they get going again." He started driving as silence fell over them. Her eyes moved to the blur of snowflakes outside her window, mesmerized as she watched the hospital disappearing from view. Too many years. Too much of her life spent there, and finally, she didn't have to stare at the red brick walls that had made her a prisoner. Still, she couldn't relax, not alone with this man. The rumble of his truck was loud, but after a moment, she picked up another sound, something higher-pitched and whiny. She tensed, her mind spinning with possibilities. Turning to stare out the back window, she watched a single headlight appear behind them. The intensity of its light was fast increasing and dazzled her eyes. Her breath caught in her throat before she spun round to face the front, and she dropped low into the seat. They'd found her. This was someone from the hospital coming to take her back. It had to be. Who else could it be zooming toward the truck at this speed? "Are you okay?" While his attention was still on the road, he glanced at her, concern in his eyes. She knew she was acting every bit the crazy person she didn't want to be. But she didn't know how to get her racing mind to calm down. "Kids and their damn motorcycles," he grumbled. He tapped the brakes a few times. From her spot, she ducked deeper. Even if she looked behind her again, there was no way she'd be able to make out the person tailgating them. It was weaving back and forth. The light blinded her from its reflection as it glanced the side mirror. Each time it did, she swore her heart stopped. "Driving like an ass on a night like this will only get us all killed," Pat muttered, shaking his head as he gripped the steering wheel. "Shit." A single word whispered. The truck hit a patch of ice and was spinning out of control, tires squealing. Holly's mouth opened, but not a sound came out as the trees on the side of the road rose to meet them. At the last moment, she squeezed her eyes shut and prepared for impact, for the darkness to whisk her away, and to have failed her attempt to escape.